Chapter 1029. The dim candlelight spread in the direction of the curtain. At the end of the light was a beauty that seemed to be carved out of ice. The face that emerged from the darkness was like the snow fairy described in the myths, but the straight nose and chin seemed to be carved with a chisel. Every line was delicate and clear. She was looking at a young man in front of her, and there was an occasional flash of blue light in the depths of her eyes. The young man was sitting on a dusty wooden crate. His brows were furrowed and one of his hands was propped up on his cheek. His elbow was on his thigh, and he was unconsciously using his polished riding boots to grind the glass shards scattered in the dust. The sharp shards shone in the candlelight like pearls in the gravel. "Greta, you seem to be impatient." The woman's voice seemed to come from the abyss of nightmares. It was like a bone-piercing icy wind that froze everything in its path. It made a crisp rustling sound that would make a mortal's hair stand on end. But the young man called Greta was not a mortal. To be exact, he was a dead man. The dead did not feel cold because they did not have any body temperature. Upon hearing the question, Greta looked up and stared at the Queen of Banshees with the dark red soul fire that was like surging blood. He then showed an elegant smile. This smile was better than the smile on the face of the most cultured and elegant human gentleman. It was just that it appeared incongruously on a bloodless, cold and stiff face. But it did not feel strange at all. Instead, it made people feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. "It's not like you don't know, Madame Yalvit. I didn't want to come to this godforsaken place from the beginning. People often say that the undead have the least style because they always stay in those lifeless places. And this place is 100 times more tasteless than the most tasteless undead. May I ask, don't you feel bored staying in this place?" The future imperial sword of Madara, known as the strongest sword saint after Darius, spread out his hands and asked, "I don't feel bored, nor do I feel bored. That kind of thing has no meaning to me, but I know you're not worried about that, but about the person you're about to meet." Yalvit coldly replied, "That's right. That's because he's the master of this place. An existence that's even more terrifying than a place that's 100 times more tasteless than the most tasteless undead is the master of this place. I hope that he doesn't become complacent about his masterpiece. That would be even more terrifying. Actually, what do you have to worry about? I've seen that person before. Before he died, we met once. At that time he was also a mortal, but his bloodline was more noble. He was a Myrna, that's all. How many years have you lived, lady? I thought you should ask, how many years have you been dead? All right, just pretend I didn't say anything." The young man had no choice but to ask, "Have you really seen that person?" Yalvit nodded. "About 1,200 years ago I met him once in the Yas Bay. But at that time we were both in a hurry. I know who he is, but he doesn't know who I am." "How was he at that time? Was he as scary as the rumors say? Are you afraid of him?" the Queen of Banshees asked. "Don't tell me that I'm not afraid of him?" Greta was slightly startled. She couldn't help but lower her head to check her appearance, trying to figure out what she was doing wrong. "You look scared, but the undead can't feel real fear. What a failure." The young man sighed. He's a prophet. He witnessed the fall of the empire with his own eyes. For 1,000 years, he watched as his people declined, were exiled, and were forgotten by Martha. He watched as everything that was once glorious disappeared into nothingness. The wind and sand buried the relics of an era behind history. But he was indifferent. Does he not have power? No, the legends say that he has the power to destroy the world. In Mardos, his position is second only to the Dark Dragon. No, maybe even higher. It's just that no one knows about it. As long as he makes a move, the four sages have no chance of winning. But he was indifferent. What is he thinking? What are you thinking? Yalvit looked at Greta in surprise. "These things have nothing to do with you. I'm thinking that such a person must be keeping a secret. This secret can answer all the questions. That person asked us to come here. Doesn't that prove it?" Greta said excitedly. "I thought you wouldn't be so curious." "How boring, madam. But I admire you for keeping your mouth shut." The Queen of Banshees stared at the dead man with her blue eyes until the latter flinched. "Well, it doesn't matter if you don't tell me. Anyway, I think a person like you who has lived for thousands or even hundreds of years definitely knows something," Greta said helplessly. "But I've been thinking about a question for a long time. During the war 60 years ago, all the countries should have seen something corresponding to it. How could they remain indifferent until now? Did something happen during this period that even we don't know about?" What I mean is," Greta suddenly stood up and gestured. "Don't you think it's ridiculous?" Yalvit looked at her in confusion. Greta scratched his hair, which was as messy as hay, and explained, Why didn't they settle the matter once and for all? Why did they leave all the conflicts until today? I mean, Her Majesty the Queen of the Kurlutzians. If I remember correctly, during the Second Holy War, the dragons and the Bugas should have been present. They could have handled the matter perfectly, but they chose to remain indifferent and even encouraged the development of the situation. If it weren't for them, where would Her Majesty the Queen of today be? Yalvit frowned slightly as if she had no interest in this. Maybe they were happy to see it happen, or maybe they were confused. You have to understand that since 1,000 years ago, the 4 holy cathedrals have been on the side of justice. This justice is not the justice that they preach, nor is it hypocritical. If they can't stand on this point, they will lose their morals. Just like the Holy Cathedral of Fire today, whether it's the priests and bishops of the new church or the old church, they can still perform magic and gain power from the golden flame. This shows that the morals in their hearts are not skewed, it's just that their standpoints are different. You seem to know their doctrines very well? Greta's eyes lit up as if she had discovered a new continent. But Yalvit shook her head impatiently and denied it. If you were to witness the history of the 4 holy cathedrals from the birth of the 4 holy cathedrals to today, you would also understand more. Greta showed an expression that was uglier than crying. My lady, although I understand that you are very qualified to say this, can you not always talk about this? It's hurting my self-confidence. Experience can make a person incomparably wise, and time has not left the slightest trace on you. Instead, it has increased your glory and charm. I know that this is very enviable, but if you keep showing off like this, I won't be able to stand it. Yalvit did not say a word in response to Greta's words. Apparently, she was already used to the way this young person spoke. The latter did not get a response from her, but he was not discouraged at all. He continued, but I agree with you. Perhaps they are also very confused, but if Her Majesty is the destined hero, then what is there for them to be confused about? Some things have not happened yet, and no one can say whether it is right or wrong. In other words, there is another possibility? The Queen of Banshees suddenly turned her head and asked coldly, what are you trying to say? Nothing. Greta smiled. It's just a theory. Speaking of which, you should have seen the real heroes, right? For example, the 4 wise ones, Lady Yalvit? More or less. In that era, I have heard some of their legends, but I have never seen them in person. What about the Flame King? He is a little special. That young man is filled with infinite possibilities. Those bards used miracles to describe his life. It is quite appropriate. In that case, the Flame King is indeed a legend. Greta asked again. Lady Yalvit, do you think there is anyone in this world who can truly foresee the future? There is one where you are. No. Greta shook her head and said, that person's foresight of the future is at most a kind of revelation. Prophets can see strange scenes from the revelation. These scenes are chaotic, but they are only a corner of the future. They can see these fragments, but they are powerless to change them. What I am saying is, if someone can see the future and change it, unless the person you are talking about is a god. It is said that in the ancient era, only the gods had such an ability. Yalvit replied coldly. After hearing this, Greta did not say anything else and lowered her head to think. After a short while, a huge dusty door in front of the two suddenly made a creaking sound, and then slowly opened to both sides. There was no one behind the huge door, as if it had its own consciousness and automatically welcomed guests from afar. Yalvit and Greta both raised their heads at the same time and saw a hunchbacked old man slowly walking out from the darkness behind the door. This old man was wearing a long robe and holding an ordinary wooden staff. He trembled as he walked, like a candle in the wind. At any time he would run out of oil. But when Tarek saw him, he could not help but stand in awe. Some people were sung in legends, but some people were legends themselves. Just like this old man in front of him. As early as an era ago, his stories were as numerous as the stars in Wonde. His name, whether it was 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years later, was enough to shock anyone. Although it was just the name of an ordinary Myrna person, it did not even need to be described in words. It had already reverberated in the darkness. Even Greta could not help bowing her head deeply under the gaze of that pair of onyx eyes. However, only Yvette was still standing tall and proud. The light of the sun streaked across the sky to the west of Metz. It did not stop for a moment because of anyone's attention. It was like a burning meteor, falling at an unstoppable speed to the end of the western sea and sky of the continent. When a certain period of time passed, the silver woodland was no longer sunny. Instead, it was dyed with a layer of light red glow. Dusk was faintly discernible in the western horizon, and the stars were like diamond powder embellished on the light purple background of the sunset. The White Legion Knights were escorting the undead army through the last part of the Golden Needle Valley. The Knight Captain Ruoli looked up at the sky. The time was just right. Although the valley had long been empty, the mountain people had continued to migrate north. The south of the Latch of Wa had attracted the attention of the incompetent nobles of Fathom Port, but no one was willing to spend the night in this forest full of strange legends, especially with such a large number of skeletons. Although they were the bravest knight, most of the legends in this forest came from the creepy stories of the mountain people. Those legends from the previous era were full of awe-inspiring mysteries. He raised his hand and made a gesture to the knight beside him. The last part of the valley was in front of them. The slowly rising and falling ridge formed a narrow pass. It was the most complicated area in the area, and it was also very suitable for an ambush. Although this place had long been deserted, out of a cautious nature, he felt that it would be safer to send out scouts to investigate according to Cruz's military instructions. Ruoli deeply understood this point. The reason why the Duke had chosen him to carry out this important mission was because of his cautious nature. This kind of character was a little too indecisive for a commander, but it was suitable for the current situation. After all, he had never thought that he would be promoted to a higher rank. The Knight Captain was already a position that he was satisfied with in the Empire. The Knight Captain was his personal guard. He quickly understood what he meant and set off on his horse. Ruoli noticed that when the dragon passed through the forest, it did not startle any birds. This was not a good sign, and it made him frown deeply. Sure enough, after a short while, he heard his personal guard roaring, followed by the sound of men and horses. With his many years of experience, he could even distinguish the sound of arrows piercing through the air. Ambush. The knight's voice and the voice in his mind sounded at the same time. Chapter 1030. At dusk, the forest was filled with people screaming and horses neighing. The roars of the land dragons resounded through the forest as if a huge monster was fighting in the forest. It was unsettling. The land dragon knight of the White Legion felt as if arrows were flying towards them from all directions. They did not know how many people were hiding in the dark, so they had no choice but to retreat. The setting sun shone over the long ridge and into the valley. The sky and earth were orange-red. Yuta's flame-like hair was dazzling under the setting sun. After shooting a few arrows consecutively, she saw that the Cruz Knight vanguard had begun to retreat. She immediately ordered the young wizard beside her. "Quick, follow the plan. Commander, you have to let me take a break." Crew was so tired that sweat was flowing down his forehead like a waterfall. He could not help but complain loudly. "Do you think this kind of large-scale illusion is easy to use? Not to mention there are two of them. Cut the crap. This is an order. If you can't do it, I'll cut your head off." Crew could not help but curse in his heart. He did not care that the person who came up with this plan was Mare, whom he had praised before. However, he still used his fastest speed to recite the spell. He waved the staff in his hand and a hazy army suddenly appeared under his command. It was like the mountain fog had gathered out of thin air. In the fog, people were screaming and horses were neighing, outlining the outline of a cavalry that was ready to go. Crew trembled as he maintained the staff in his hand. The army also ran parallel to the retreating Cruz Knight through the forest and attacked the flanks of the large army. The distance was at least 200 or 300 meters through the thick forest and the light was dim. The panicked Kurlet's knights did not have much time to confirm the authenticity of the cavalry. When they saw the cavalry coming towards their side, they were scared out of their wits. There was obviously a large army in front of them, and if they let the cavalry outflank them and cut off their retreat, then they would all die here. Although they were escorting a few thousand skeletons, this thing actually had no combat power, unless the number was really tens of thousands. Madara's skeleton soldiers on the battlefield were counted in units of tens of thousands. In order to avoid detection, they were only escorting a batch of this skeleton army. If the tens of thousands of skeletons were here, then it would be more like it. The leading knight did not hesitate and immediately shouted a warning to the other side of the forest. At the same time, he took out a signal flare from the bag under the saddle. He raised his hand and activated the magic runes in it. Bang! A dazzling signal flare was shot into the air. The red and dazzling light slowly rose into the sky above the valley, like a bunch of fireworks, blooming in the air. Knight Marjolie's head was raised, and the eye-catching light was reflected in his eyes. Dozens of his personal knights did the same thing. Everyone was looking up at the sky, but Marjolie reacted in a moment. He immediately turned his head, waved his hand and roared, "There's an ambush! Back to back, get into formation. Argian, Pierre, get the skeletons to move and guard against the cavalry." As the frontline legion of the Cruz Empire, the performance of the Knight of the White Legion could be said to be perfect. They did not panic at all. It was as if they moved in an instant and formed a circular formation. The huge ground dragons were tamed by these excellent riders. One by one they lowered their bodies so that they could lay their spears flat. With a light whoosh, a row of spears was erected in the forest. The knights who were called out stepped out of the crowd and began to organize the skeletons. In fact, they did not need to do anything. The undead had no morale in the first place and they would not panic because of a surprise attack. Under the command of the commander, the skeletons quickly tightened their formation and gathered in rows to guard against the possible attack of the cavalry. The knights who were in charge of organizing the skeletons realized that their only role was to be the flag bearers and mark the position of each column of skeletons on the battlefield. In less than 10 minutes, an orderly and strict formation had appeared in the forest. Seeing this scene from afar, the young men from Erewhon were obviously surprised. Even the person who came up with the plan, Mayor himself, was no exception. It was important to know that in a war, making a battle plan was only one aspect. Whether the script went according to the plan or not was another aspect. This was related to many factors, and it was not something that could be solved by relying on geniuses. For example, some commanders were cautious and some were reckless. In a situation where the enemy was unknown, many situations on the battlefield could only be decided by Lady Martha. At this time, the young knight on Erewhon's side could not help but shout in their hearts, "Martha bless us. Don't relax, this won't last long." Yuta was, after all, a mercenary commander. At this time, she did not forget to pour cold water on the young men who were getting carried away. Later on there will be a bloody battle. How long you can delay this Cruz army depends on your ability. However, the young men were obviously a little excited. They thought that Cruz was just SOSO and did not listen to her words. Yuta knew what they were thinking and could not help but sigh. In fact, she was not optimistic about the upcoming battle. Cruz's army's performance was better than she expected. These foreign knights' performance was not comparable to that of an ordinary army. Even the White Lion Guards that she had seen in Tanajul might not be as strong as this. Cruz was Cruz. The spirit of the empire was not something a small country like Erewhon could compare to. However, she also knew that this was not the time to persuade them. She would not do anything that would hurt their morale. She just did not know how many of these young men would survive. She looked at Mare's side. The young man from the Wangli Knight Academy was also frowning slightly, but overall he was much less worried than she was. At least Cruz's army had begun to move. It was not easy to change the formation on the battlefield. Even if they realized that something was wrong, it would take them at least 10 minutes to make a new decision. Plus the time to rearrange the formation, it was more than enough to delay them here for an hour. However, that was not enough. They had to use the terrain to delay these night as long as possible. Yuta glanced at the setting sun. She only hoped that the sun would set soon. After sunset, it would not be easy for Cruz's army to figure out how many people were in the forest. In fact, when the vanguard knight of the White Legion rushed out of the forest, Mariri and the knights around him had already noticed that something was wrong. Unlike the knights who ran back in a hurry, they could calmly judge the current situation. Mariri was worried about how many people were in front of them and which side they were from. Was it the army of the nobles in Ludwig? Or the Black Legion? Or the army in Fattan Port? He was thinking about this question until the rumbling of hooves sounded in the forest. Hooves? Knight Mariri was slightly startled. He thought that it was light cavalry. This was not surprising. In this kind of terrain, it was easier for light cavalry to spread out than light cavalry. For example, his land dragon knight could only passively defend. However, the problem was that the sound of hooves was too dense. For a veteran knight like him, it was like an instinct. He could judge the direction of the enemy, the approximate size of the enemy, and even the speed and other factors from the sound of the hooves and footsteps. Although it was not very accurate, it was not a problem to guess the general situation. The familiarity of war had long seeped into the blood of these professional knights, and Maruli quickly realized where the problem was. Such a dense sound of horse hooves meant that there was at least one light cavalry unit in a dense formation in the forest that was rapidly advancing. This was too illogical. At this time, the cleric beside him reminded him, "Mr. Knight, look at the cavalry in the forest." A cleric who looked to be at most in his 20s pointed in the direction of the forest and said to him, "That cavalry does not look real. It is very likely that it is an illusion created by magic." Mary was not familiar with magic, but this sentence was enough for him. He immediately realized that he had been fooled. "That cavalry is fake. Be careful of the enemy's tricks," he shouted angrily. Before he could finish his words, The army that had broken through the fog dissipated with a loud bang. Just like the fog that had dispersed, they disappeared into nothingness in the forest. At this time, everyone understood that it was a false alarm. Oh! Beside Yuta and the others, Crew could not help but scream. He shouted in shame and anger, "The spell has failed. Someone has dispelled my spell." He looked like he had just been fished out of the water. His whole body was wet, but it was dripping with sweat. After casting these two spells, he was completely unable to move. He leaned on the silver tree beside him and gasped for breath. "It's okay. It's not your fault. Crew, you did a good job." They should have realized that it was the cleric who dispelled the spell. Yuta comforted him and said, "Next, you should hide in a corner and recover your magic. Don't get close to the battlefield. We will attract their attention." Although Crew was very weak, he could not help but jump up when he heard this sentence. Although he had been cursing before, he was very clear that the next battle would be the most dangerous. If they wanted to delay the cavalry of Crew's, they not only had to make the other side not know how many people they had, but they also had to make the other side feel the pain. This would definitely be a tough battle. Maybe they would pay the price of blood and life. Anyone here could die here, and of course he was no exception. "I want to be with you. Don't you think you can leave me behind?" he retorted loudly. The first priority of a wizard on the battlefield is to protect yourself. The beautiful female mercenary captain swung her head, her red hair spreading out like flames. She smiled at the young magus and said, "This." Crew suddenly found that almost all of his companions were on the captain's side. He could not help but stare and said, "You?" But before he could finish his words, he felt someone hit him from behind. His vision turned black and he suddenly fell down. Mare reached out and caught him, then raised his head and gave Yuta a look. "We need someone to send a message to the Lord. This task will be given to him. Go and put a magic mark on the tree." Mir nodded, turned around and disappeared from everyone's sight. After he left, Yuta pulled out her sword and said to the young knight in front of her indifferently, "Don't look at me with such a tragic expression. We are not going to die. What are you afraid of? What are you looking forward to? Before today, have you ever thought that you would gallop on the land of the Crew's empire and fight with the White Legion, the #1 opponent in the world? Some of you may die here, but no one dares to laugh at you because your opponent is so strong and respectable. But if you succeed, then after today your name will be known throughout the land of Wond." The young men's eyes shone brightly. The burning flame was the determination of a gambler, and the endless desire and pursuit of victory. Remember your titles. We are the White Lion Guards. It was the Lord who gave you this name. He has never failed, and you will be the same. The female mercenary commander's sword drew a shining arc under the setting sun and pointed forward. It was like a straight line of faith, indestructible and shining brightly. "Follow me. Let this lion bare its claws." The young knight roared and shouted in unison, "Fight for Erwin. Glory in our bodies, glory in our swords." Under the setting sun, the mountains seemed to be in eternal sleep. Sir Mary made his own judgment at the first moment. There couldn't be too many enemies. Otherwise they wouldn't be deliberately mystifying. The other party's purpose was obviously to try to keep him here. This was not an ambush but an interception. But the problem was how many people were involved in the interception. If there weren't too many, then he could choose to force his way through. But if there were too many, then he might break his head and bleed. He suddenly fell into hesitation. The empty valley in front of the Kurlutzians was like an open bloody mouth, full of the unknown and uneasiness. "Sir Knight, it's time for you to make a decision." After the crowd separated, a middle-aged man in a long robe came out from behind and said to Sir Mary, "The people in front are obviously stalling for time. They may be waiting for reinforcements. We can't stay here for too long." Sir Mary looked back at the man. The man's face was as pale as a vampire's, and he was so thin that it seemed like a gust of wind could blow him away. Sir Mary looked back at the man and glanced at the dark crystal ring on his finger. He nodded and said, "Don't worry, Archmage Unsirai. We will definitely send you safely to the Latch of Wa." The man smiled contemptuously and said, "You don't have to call me Archmage. I know my own identity very well. I'm not trying to urge you to do anything, but I just want to remind you that we still don't know which side the people in front of us are from. In such a situation, it's best to make a decision quickly to avoid any more trouble." Sir Mary nodded slowly and looked at his knight. "Let's test the waters. Wait. What now?" Sir Mary's eyes flashed with a hint of dissatisfaction. "It's better to let my skeletons do it. It's not worth it to waste the noble knights of the Empire on probing. My subordinates were originally used for this purpose, so it can be considered a worthy death." The man rubbed his ring and answered slowly. Sir Mary was very angry that the man compared human life with the word worth. But he knew that the man meant well, so he relaxed a little and nodded. Chapter 1031. Some things were easier said than done. That was why there were so many empty talkers in the world. On the battlefield, people would tell themselves that as long as they could overcome their fear of death, they would be able to face their fear easily. However, when the blade was about to touch their heads, they would often be able to understand the lightness of the Grim Reaper's footsteps from the indifferent eyes of the enemy. Your head would fall to the ground and the world would spin in front of your eyes. Finally, you would fall into dust. The battlefield would be filled with darkness and decay. The symbol that represented your existence, your name, your status, your beliefs, and your family, would be reduced to nothingness under this sword. After that, there would be no beginning or end. No one would know what the world after death would be because it might not exist. The mountains, rivers, forests, and plains would still be the same color. The sun, the moon, and the stars would still move side by side. The place where you left the world would be filled with white flowers and green grass, but you would not be able to feel all of this again. Before a catastrophe, fear would seep into your bones, and then your heart would be bitterly cold. Although Yuta was not a fledgling who had just stepped onto the battlefield, even though in the south of Erewhon the war between the nobles was full of small skirmishes, but as a mercenary she had also experienced life and death several times. When a person experienced death and bathed in blood on the battlefield, there would be a complete transformation. Some veterans who walked out of the battlefield believed that it was because the person who had experienced all of this had released the beast in their heart. Yuta did not know what the beast in her heart was. At this moment she only felt an unprecedented seriousness. This kind of seriousness was the same as many years ago when she was alone and holding a long sword to face the bandits that appeared in the wilderness of Shabnuo Mountain. The cold wind blew away the sweat on her forehead, and her fiery red hair stuck to both sides of her forehead. However, she did not feel it at all. Her 5 fingers were tightly clenched on the sword. This sword was once given to her by the young lord. The red crystal on the hammer emitted a deep light under the night sky. The tension in her heart came from the heavy responsibility. This responsibility came from the control of the fate of others. She was afraid that her decision would send these outstanding young people to their deaths. Although they had already disregarded life and death, who could guarantee that what they did was really meaningful? Would she be able to live up to the trust in their eyes? Although Yuta had already become the leader, she was unable to answer these 2 questions. She did not know that she was already standing at a crossroad. Countless people had stood at this crossroad. At this crossroad, human nature had to overcome cowardice. Some people chose to retreat, but even more people hit their heads and bled. They became cold, heartless, ignorant, and arrogant. Only a few people could truly see their own hearts and take that crucial step to become the best commanders. This was a choice on the battlefield. On this square chessboard, the chess pieces had the courage of the chess pieces, and the chess players had to have the courage of the chess players. The mountain wind blew through the treetops, making a soft rustling sound, as if it was mocking the meaningless killing in the mortal world. The gods had left long ago, but only their children were left to hurt each other. The battlefield was littered with broken bones. The eerie white bones were buried between the rocks. A few black steel longswords were stabbed into the soft soil. If it were not for the black rose flag fluttering in the night wind, Yuta would almost think that this was the battlefield of Grimoires. There was no doubt that there had just been a battle here. The invaders were skeletons controlled by crews. She ordered Mare to mercilessly crush these enemies. Compared with the Madara army in the Silverman Valley, these undead were not worth mentioning at all. The battle ended quickly, and the necromancers did not have the ability to use the skeletons' vision to investigate. Besides, the skeletons had no vision to speak of. Therefore they were likely not exposed yet. But this was nothing to be happy about because the real challenge was yet to come. Everyone knew this in their hearts. This is a probing attack. The White Legion's knight is likely to follow behind. Yuta agreed with this view and nodded gently. Sure enough, 3 ghost-like white dragons and the White Legion's knight riding on them emerged from the forest. These people were obviously the vanguard of the Knight Regiment. The crew's side did not know how many enemies were lying in ambush behind the Silver Forest, so they were also carefully deploying their actions. Seeing that the crew's people were more cautious than expected, Yuta's eyes lit up. She immediately raised her sword and shouted in a low voice, "Charge!" She knew that she could not give the enemy too much time, lest they figured out the situation on her side. At this moment there was no room for regret. Even if it was a mistake, she had to make it to the end. The short command contained a special kind of power. The young knight from Erewhon launched a strong attack like a flash of lightning. The wind in the mountain pass was always abnormally cold. The grass swayed between the rocks and the gravel was blown by the wind. In the face of all this, the cruise's people were shocked. Heavy cavalry always had an overwhelming advantage when facing light cavalry head-on. In the eyes of the cruise's people, these people who were rushing towards them were crazy. But after all, they were professional soldiers. After a short moment of shock, they reacted quickly. They raised their spears and prepared to fight. This series of actions on the dragons was almost instinctive. Originally, these knights were the vanguard who came to investigate the enemy's ambush in any direction. If they found the enemy's ambush in any direction, they should immediately withdraw and inform the main force behind. But when they found that there were not many enemies, they thought that it was likely that they were the enemy's scouts. So, their first reaction was to meet the enemy. This series of judgments made them miss the best opportunity to distinguish between the truth and the truth. Although they did not think that they would lose. Yuta maintained her position in the charge. She could already feel the oppressive feeling of the huge body of the dragon in front of her, especially when the distance between the two was getting closer and closer. She could even see the huge, cold, gray-brown eyes of the enemy, with vertical pupils that were characteristic of cold-blooded animals. A knight was sitting on the high and smooth back of the dragon. She could not see the face of the cruise's person, but he was holding a 3-meter-long dragon spear and thrusting it towards her. The depths of Yuta's jade-like eyes shrunk to a deep point. In the glittering light, the tip of the spear was reflected. The tip of the spear pierced the neck of the warhorse, making a series of crisp sounds of bones breaking. But before that, Yuta had instinctively jumped from the saddle. The warhorse fell under her feet, whining and rolling down the mountain stream. She passed by the dragon and grabbed the metal buckle on the opponent's saddle in midair. The cruise knight was a little surprised but not too surprised. He pulled out his sword, the standard cavalry sword of the White Legion. It was longer than an elbow and a half, with a short blade and a thick blade. There was a weight added to the blade, so when he swung the sword, it was like a curved black moon towards Yuta. Most people could not change their direction in the air, but this was obviously an exception. Suddenly, a red sword appeared in Yuta's hand. Flame! She shouted angrily, and a dazzling flame appeared on the tip of the sword. The knight did not have time to react before he was engulfed in flames. Ah! The knight let out a shrill scream, and the sword in his hand flew out towards Yuta. Yuta dodged sideways and the sword flew past her cheek. Her weapon. The knight's companions finally noticed the change in the battle. They tightened the reins, trying to turn their behemoths around to support their companions. But Yuta would not give them the chance. "Mare, hold them back," she shouted, and at the same time she kicked the chest of the knight, who was burned beyond recognition. Because the dragon knight was fastened to the saddle with a belt, this kick only caused the knight to sway a little. That was enough. She had already landed firmly on the drake's back. She reached out and grabbed the knight's helmet, forcing him to tilt his head back to reveal the weakest part of his neck. Then she slit his throat with her sword. Steaming hot blood spurted out, covering her gloves and wrists. Janna's expression did not change. She sheathed her sword and swung it hard, cutting off the leather straps on the knight's thighs and calves. Then she tossed him off the drake's back as if he was trash. The remaining knight crews could not help but be angry when he saw this scene. He roared, "Damn it!" They immediately left Mare and the others and turned to attack in this direction. Of course, this decision was not only driven by anger, because Yuta, who had seized the dragon, was now the biggest threat to them. The scout cavalry alone was not a threat to heavy knight like them, but the rider on the dragon's back was different, not to mention that this woman had shown first-class strength. Moreover, she had a fantasy weapon in her hand. In a battle of this level, this weapon was the power that could change the outcome of the battle. Sir Mary was quietly waiting for the results of the battle. He did not know how many enemies there should be behind the forest. Judging from the previous performance, it should not be too many, but no one dared to guarantee that. War was not a gamble. Perhaps this was just a means to confuse them? Therefore he carefully sent out a few vanguard teams and let the main force follow closely behind. The free time was just enough for the skeletons to regroup. The false alarm just now had wasted a lot of time. He faintly felt that something was wrong. He could not help but subconsciously look in the direction of the Latch Mountains. In that direction, a huge fireball was gradually sliding below the horizon. On one side of the dark blue sky, Wei Uedimus outlined a silvery white silhouette. It was not early anymore. He turned his head back a little anxiously. In front of him was a pitch-black sea of shining silver trees. In fact, it was not that thick. Fog had already started to form in the forest. Shadows flickered and it was silent. Only the rustling of footsteps echoed in his ears, as well as the heavy footsteps of the earth dragon. The silent darkness was more like a terrifying monster, quietly waiting for its prey. Why hasn't anyone come back yet? He finally could not help but ask. This kind of silent and uneasy waiting was suffocating. The skeletons sent out are all gone. The middle-aged man dressed as a wizard said in a lower voice, but they were not destroyed fast enough. The enemy may be really short of manpower. But my people haven't come back yet. Sir Mary frowned and replied. They probably won't come back, the middle-aged man replied with a frown. But we can't be held back here by them. He looked back and said, My servants are ready. It's time to give the order, Commander. Sir Mary looked at the flickering forest again and hesitated for a moment. He knew that the middle-aged man was probably right. The enemy dared to hold them back even though they were short of manpower, which meant that they were probably an elite force. If that was the case, then the vanguard he sent out might really not come back. But if he guessed wrong, then a wrong order would bury the entire army here. Perhaps his own death would not be regretted, but if that secret fell into the enemy's hands, he could not help but shudder at the thought of it. But he could not stay still. The feeling of uneasiness was still lingering in his heart. On the other side of the forest, the last drake fell heavily on the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. Beside the huge body of the drake, Yuta was bathed in blood. The two young men were also seriously injured. Only Mare was in a slightly better condition, but he was also injured. The battle did not last long, but for Yuta and the rest, it was a long battle. The White Legion Knight's strength was outstanding. Except for Yuta, even the most outstanding among the young men, Mare, was far behind. If Yuta had not taken out one of the vanguard at the beginning and used the advantage of the weapon in her hand and the deterrence of the explosive crystal, they would have paid a heavy price even if they had taken down the vanguard cavalry in the end. Casualties were inevitable, and they might not have been able to stop the vanguard from reporting to the main force. Fortunately, everything went well. Cruz's army was still moving very slowly, which at least meant that everything they had done so far was worth it. But after all, the delay was not endless. It seemed that the commander of the Cruz army had finally made up his mind. Mare squinted his eyes. He could already see the dense banners of the Cruz Knight Regiment behind the Silver Flash Forest slowly moving forward. Although the undead army behind them did not have any banners, they should be following closely behind. Perhaps they were even in front. They're coming. Mare replied a little dryly. Although he had the determination to face death from the moment he became a knight, when he really waited until this moment, he realized that he might not be fully prepared. It was not because of fear or cowardice, but because he was unwilling to accept the fact that he was not fully prepared. How could he die in such a place? Jana didn't say anything. She just nodded quietly. Chapter 1032. Time was like a ghost in the forest, quietly passing by minute by minute. Sister, what is this place? Yuta widened her eyes in fear. She realized that she was not holding a sword, but a soft hand. The owner of the hand was looking at her with a tilted head. The owner of the hand was looking at her with a pair of green eyes. Her black hair was draped over her shoulders and she was wearing a white robe. Her bare feet stepped on the thick green moss like a fairy in the forest. Sister? Otis? This is... The nightmarish memories from 10 years ago came back to her. No, Otis, don't stop. Run. Yuta suddenly felt that her hand was empty. Her sister disappeared like a reflection in the water. What replaced her sister was a ray of light in the darkness. It was the tip of a sword. The illusion in front of her made her shiver. She raised the white lion sword in her hand. Clang. The two swords clashed. Sparks flew everywhere. Yuta was caught off guard and took a step back. The Knight of Cruz in full armor was also startled. Under the metal mask, a muffled voice came out. White lion sword. Erwin's people? She was distracted. Yuta broke out in cold sweat. She never thought that she would make such a fatal mistake in battle. Although the continuous battles had already made her physically and mentally exhausted, and the legend said that people would see their past before they died. Was this the sign of death? She gasped for breath. 7 or 8 swords came stabbing at her. When she was in her best condition, she had to use all her strength to fight against one of them. In the darkness, the forest was burning. The knight in white robes with a sun emblem on his chest came out of the darkness. The slave traders fell under the shining swords in their hands. However, there were also slaves who panicked and fell under the hooves of their horses. The knight showed no mercy and trampled on the mountain people and the Senia people. The sound of the fire burning with the wind, the sound of buildings collapsing, angry roars and cries mixed together. She and her sister, who was also naked, hid under a shabby tent. The tent was filled with the stench of urine and feces. However, she really hoped that she could hide in this small space forever. The dancing shadows in the darkness were retreating. Through the tent, she could see the shadows of swords and blood. A long sword finally found an opportunity to break through her defenses and pierced her shoulder. Crimson blood gushed out, and the excruciating pain made Jana feel as if the scene in front of her had overlapped with the scene from decades ago. 7 or 8 knights surrounded her, their swords gleaming coldly. Their eyes were vigilant, and they did not give her any chance to perish together with them. Then she felt a sword in her lower abdomen. Her strength seemed to be draining away. She half knelt on the ground. The knight of crews who surrounded her were like wolves in the forest waiting for an opportunity to strike. They were the wolves. In Bragg's in that summer night in the stag forest. The wolves howled softly. Their red eyes were hidden under the night sky. She used one hand to protect her sister, Otis. Her entire body was covered in wounds. The pain seemed to have numbed her nerves. One of her eyes was covered in blood, but she still stared fiercely at those beasts. She was even more ferocious than any of them. She had been on the run for a long time. It felt like she was going to die at any moment. But every time she miraculously survived. Because she could not give up. For her sister. You are called Ovisha. Little girl, you are a villager, right? This is my grandson. His name is Brando. No, there are some things about you that he will never have. People who live a good life will never understand these things. You want to learn swordsmanship from me? The old man smiled. I'm afraid not. But I can recommend you to a place. That person might protect you for my sake. But her sister was still dead. Because she was too weak. Even after so many years, she still could not protect her. Yuta could not help but cry. The tears washed away the blood and flowed down her cheeks like a stream mixed with blood. She hated the people who brought injustice to this world. She hated the nobles who did nothing but push the evil from behind. She hated everyone's indifference. She hated everything that was old. But she could not do anything. Otis's death seemed to be inevitable. She could not change it, nor could she fight back. Even though she often cursed with her teeth clenched, she did not know whether she was cursing her own weakness or the people who caused all this. A cruise knight walked in front of her. The metal armor made creaking sounds as he raised his sword. She had become a knight. She was already a member of the nobles. But what was she fighting for? The lord and the princess were changing everything. Was it really the world that her sister wanted? Facing the sharp sword that flashed with cold light, Yuta was at a loss for a moment. Erwin's people? When he heard the name, Sir Mary also felt a chill down his spine. Why are they here? Aren't they at Fatan Port? That place is more than 100 miles away from here. Could it be that their spies are already here? Do they know something? He asked a series of questions in a row. It was obvious that the knight who sent the message could not answer these questions. He could not even answer any of the questions. They were also inexplicably surprised. They originally thought that it was the army of the nobles in the north, or the army of the Flower Territory. This answer was beyond their expectations. Moreover, why were these Erwin's people so strong? The combat power of this cavalry scout was beyond their most optimistic estimation of the weak country. Even their knights on the plateau could not resist the White Legion, let alone delay the more elite knights of the White Legion. They only had less than 10 people. Where did this Erwin's army come from? Who were they? Countless questions emerged in Sir Mary's heart. Did you see their emblem clearly? Are they really Erwin's people? Yes, sir. That is the White Lion emblem. The White Lion Legion? Sir Mary shook his head in disbelief. No, although the intelligence said that there are indeed soldiers of the White Lion Legion among the Erwin's people who stayed at Fatan Port, and the White Lion Legion is indeed the strongest legion of the Erwin's people, but it is far from this level. This must be a trap set by the Northerners or simply a disguise by the Bugis unless... An idea suddenly emerged in his mind uncontrollably. Unless what, sir? Unless it is another army. Sir Mary asked with some seriousness, are you sure that is the White Lion emblem, the White Lion emblem of the Erwin's people? I was just about to say this, sir. That emblem is a little different from the White Lion emblem we have learned. There is a broken sword on it. Broken sword? Why would there be a broken sword on the White Lion emblem? Sir Mary was very confused. Where did these damn Erwin's people come from? He suddenly felt that something was wrong. No matter who the other party was, they must have some ulterior motive for trying so hard to keep him in this place. When he thought of the fighting power of the Erwin's cavalry scouts, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. The knight captain of the most elite knight regiment in the crew's frontline legion, the White Legion, was actually scared in the face of an Erewhon's army. It was a little ridiculous. But as soon as he thought of more, no, as long as the same number of Erewhon's knights under his command came, he dared not say that he had the confidence to win. When did the Erewhon's people become so strong? Or had the empire fallen to such a state? Sir Mary suddenly felt a little sad. As a knight, he was not afraid of dying on the battlefield, but he knew what kind of secret he was holding at the moment. This secret must not fall into the hands of the enemy, whether the other party was the Northerners pretending to be mysterious, or the real Erewhon's people. He looked back and saw that the gloomy wizard also had the same expression. They both nodded. Prepare to attack. Don't pay attention to the harassment of the cavalry scouts. As long as anyone dares to block the path of the army, crush them. Before nightfall we must pass through this valley. He fiercely pulled out his long sword. Crews, destroy all enemies you see. But this time there was no roaring sound of agreement. The scene was a little strange. Even Maruoli himself was at a loss for words. A man with a sword slowly walked out of the forest. His black windbreaker reflected the silver moonlight. The sword in his hand seemed to be singing softly under the night sky. It trembled slightly, and a trace of hazy silver light was twined around it. The wind rose in the forest and black wolves ran on the ridge and howled. Herding wolves. For some reason, this sentence appeared in Sir Mary's mind at this moment. Once upon a time, the ancient legends of the witches were regarded as bedtime stories by the world, and no one took them seriously. But one day the legends would become reality. Sir Mary did not think that this would be his last thought. A dazzling silver light lit up. It was so fast that he had seen the Grand Captain of the Knight Regiment use his sword. But at the place where the sword light exploded, silver lines spread out. This was the power of elemental powers. He himself also controlled the power of elemental powers, but just as the elemental powers in his body began to resonate with the laws, a majestic force had already suppressed it into nothingness. Under the same realm, a superior elemental powers had absolute suppression over inferior elemental powers. Sir Mary's expression changed dramatically. Before he had time to regret, a silver light had already pierced through his chest. A great knight of the elemental powers had died so inexplicably. It was not that he did not want to avoid this fatal strike, but at that moment he clearly felt that the space around him was fragmented. His every movement seemed to have been rewound by time, forever frozen in the previous moment, locking him in the eternal position of the sword. Time and space were like a huge shackle, firmly clamping down on all possibilities of evasion. This is time and space. Endless darkness poured into his consciousness as if falling into a cold abyss. Sir Mary felt his body fall from the drake. The last thing he saw was the figure of the man rampaging among his subordinates. The sword light in his hand was like a line that cut through everything, cutting the Imperial Knight into pieces. Before he closed his eyes, he already knew the identity of the other party. Count Tonagel. The wizard in the black robe said gloomily, trembling slightly. In less than a quarter of an hour, dozens of knights had been killed or injured. Only a few of them died in the mouths of the black wolves, and most of them died at the hands of the young man in front of him. The elemental awakened gold-ranked knight had no room to resist, as if he was slaughtering a chicken. This person was even more terrifying than the rumors said. The other party's strength should have already surpassed the elemental enlightenment, but he was so young. Brando's gaze fell on the battlefield full of corpses. The knight besieging Yuta and the others in the forest as well as Maruoli's guards, a total of 71 people, including the 6 who died at the hands of Yuta and the others. There should not be any fish that escaped the net, and the guy in front of him should be the last one alive. Of course, it was not entirely correct to say that he was alive, because there were some dead things in this world that could exist openly under the sun. A pack of black wolves was gathering at the edge of the forest. On the back of the tallest male wolf, a black-haired girl was sitting. She was watching everything that was happening in front of her with great interest. The massacre was reflected in her black gem-like pupils, just like an exquisite game. Brando glanced in that direction, frowned, and then he turned back. Necromancer? The black-robed wizard did not dare to be rash and nodded silently. I only have one question. How many undead armies are moving in this area? Do they only go to the Latch of Wa? These were 2 questions the black-robed wizard thought to himself, but he did not dare to say it out loud. He could only answer honestly, many. Some undead were awakened from the tombs of the cultists. There are many such tombs in this area, and some came from Al-Kash. Only a portion of these undead went to the Latch of Wa, and the rest stayed in Wayne. The ancient battlefield in the Alkash Mountains is a natural kingdom of the undead, and His Majesty is very interested in it. His Majesty? Which His Majesty? Our Majesty, of course. You're from Madara? The black-robed wizard felt the murderous aura from Brando and took a step back in fear. Count, I know what you want to do. I can help you sneak into Wayne. You can't kill me? Brando pointed into the distance and said, Do you see that woman? She's Kohua Ekis' daughter. Even if I don't kill you, you can't leave here alive. Besides, although White Lion is not afraid of death, his blood will not flow in vain. No. The soul fire under the black-robed wizard's hood suddenly burned fiercely. He raised his bone staff and was about to cast a spell to perish together with Link, but before he could do that, a sharp sword had already pierced through his chest, passing through the grayish-white flames between his ribs. The black-robed wizard's shriveled body seemed to have lost its weight and collapsed. The soul fire under his hood flickered twice, as if he could not believe that the young man in front of him was not at all interested in the secrets of controlling the undead. P.S. Happy New Year to everyone. Chapter 1033. After the death of the necromancer, his shriveled body had lost the nourishment of the flame of the soul. Suddenly, it spontaneously combusted and turned into a pile of ashes that fluttered to the ground. Brando retrieved his sword and searched through the necromancer's belongings. He did not find anything of value. Perhaps it was because the necromancer was a twisted existence. Won's mana retroaction was vividly displayed on the necromancer's body. In his previous life, many players were unwilling to fight the necromancers for this reason. He furrowed his brows slightly and pondered over the details of the treasure that Bai had described. Then, he recalled something and turned his gaze to the necromancer's bone staff that was lying quietly by the side. The so-called necromancers in Madara were not necromancers who were proficient in dark witchcraft or necromancy. Instead, they were liches. The necromancer from before was naturally the same. Those who were not familiar with Madara would not be able to tell the difference, but it was not difficult for him. Liches were relatively low-level existences in Madara's undead army. Their strength was weak, and necromancers were rare even in the kingdom of the Dead Moon. Most of them were of noble birth. They were either the direct subordinates of the undead king who held the Mercury staff, or the proud disciples of some master. The necromancer's craftsmanship was passed down from generation to generation, and they had long formed a strict organization to protect their own interests. This organization was the famous necromancer sequence. Necromancers who were born in the necromancer sequence would not easily appear in the kingdom of mortals. Even if they did appear, they would usually be surrounded by the undead army and the Black Knight. It was because of their rarity that they had a high status. They would never be killed like a bug. He remembered seeing a necromancer in Butchie and Abe's castle. That was a real necromancer, and one of the best of the younger generation of the necromancer sequence. The former was surrounded by many strong people, whether it was a lich, a Black Knight, or even a famous existence like Kabia's in Madara. Of course, there were also some lich lords in the kingdom of the Dead Moon, but most of these necromancers could not hide the disgusting smell of corpses on their bodies, just like the sneaky guy who died under his sword. Brando raised his hand, and the bone staff lying on the ground seemed to be pulled by an invisible force. It flew into his hand out of thin air, and a cold force immediately spread from the bone staff, as if it wanted to penetrate his hand and penetrate his heart. This was the power of the dark soul, which could also be said to be a type of negative energy. He could immediately tell that if he was just an ordinary person, or if he only had the strength of an iron rank, this power would immediately erode his mind and turn him into a walking corpse. When his flame of life was completely extinguished, he would transform into a new lich. This was the power of a lich's bone staff. Therefore, the body of a lich was actually this bone staff, and all its magic came from it. As for its body, it was actually just an ordinary skeleton under its control. The only difference was that the bone staff of an ordinary lich was symbiotic with its body. When the flame of life in the body was extinguished, the bone staff would also be annihilated. Scholars who were dedicated to the study of the necromancers believed that this was also a type of mana retroaction. However, the bone staff in Brando's hand was obviously different. Brando found that not only did it not lose its magic, but it also seemed to have some kind of independent will. This could be seen from the cold aura and hostility it emitted towards him. This was definitely not a simple bone staff. He had seen many tricks of these skeletons when he fought with Madara in his previous life. One of them was to use a dark treasure to create an enhanced version of the bone staff. This bone staff could allow an ordinary lich to command more undead armies. When the lich was killed, as long as the bone staff was not damaged, it could be quickly handed over to other lich to continue using. It was even a kind of pseudo-undead artifact that could continuously create lich. This bone staff had only one flaw, which was that it required the consumption of a real dark treasure. Since ancient times, the dark treasures of the necromancers were always limited. Once one was consumed, there would be one less. Once this bone staff was damaged, it would be an immeasurable loss to the necromancers. Therefore, after humans learned of their secret, this bone staff quickly disappeared. He knew this secret long ago, so when Haku described the dark treasure to him, he paid attention to it. Now he really found this bone staff. At some point in the future, the necromancers used this bone staff to make the wind elves and crews suffer a great loss. But this time, this bone staff fell into his hands, and it was their turn to suffer a loss. Brando held this bone staff with a slightly cold ivory luster. He quickly made a plan in his mind. This bone staff would erode the flame of life, so any existence with the power of life would not be able to use it. Only the necromancers could use it. That was why the necromancer who died under his sword was so shocked. It probably guessed Brando's intention, but it did not know the result. Brando turned around. At this time, another figure walked out of the dark shadows behind the forest, trembling. This figure was a little stooped and fearful, but it was not because of the strength that Brando had shown. It had already seen the strength of this young man. Even the Black Knight Haku, who had mastered the fake book of Mavikart, was completely defeated by him. It was not surprising that he could defeat dozens of Crew's knights. Although these White Legion knights were the frontline fighting force of the human empire, they were far from elites. At least, they were far from the level of the Flame Family Knight and the Temple Knight. At best, they were the backbone of ordinary battles, but when it came to battles where their elemental power surpassed that of mortals, they were still far from being elite. But what really frightened it was the words that Brando said before. Her name is Ko Hua, the daughter of Ekis. Even if I don't kill you, you won't be able to leave here alive. Few people in the world knew the name Ko Hua, but the title of the daughter of Ekis would never fade with the passage of time. Needless to say, as the people of the Dead Moon, the people of Madara knew the history buried in the darkness better. The dim Ko Hua, one of the strongest existences in the twilight. She had become his subordinate? This guess made the rotten Knight Krot feel like it was treading on thin ice. It did not know if Brando had deliberately let it hear this sentence, because there was no need to reveal this secret to a dead person. Even if the eternal sleepers would keep their mouths shut forever, who could guarantee that the walls of the forest would not have ears? Besides, as an undead, Krot knew that the saying that the dead would keep secrets was untenable. There were many ways to make the dead speak, and some of them were not complicated. To be honest, the simplest way was to put the sword to its own neck because it was an undead, it thought self-deprecatingly. In its view, Brando was not a reckless and frivolous person, so the meaning of these words was somewhat worth pondering. Especially when it saw the bone staff in Brando's hand, it instantly understood what he meant. Krot walked over with a trembling heart, trying to maintain a humble attitude. It had not learned how to be humble in front of the living, so it could only try to remind itself of the scene when it met His Majesty, although it was only once from afar. My lord, thanks to the poison. I mean the water of life, your subordinates' injuries have stabilized quickly, but their commander's injuries are more serious. According to you humans, I'm afraid that it will be easy for them to wake up in an hour and a half. But there are still a few who have completely lost their breath of life. Should we turn them into undead? My lord, your subordinates are of high quality. Although their strength may be a little weak, but turning them into undead depends on potential and not strength. I can guarantee that they will become Black Knights and the best kind, it answered carefully. Even so, it almost said the wrong thing because to the undead, holy water that contained strong positive energy was highly toxic. Before the Knight of the Holy Cathedral cleaned up the undead, they would often splash holy water on their swords. Any undead that was hit by the holy water would be like butter cut by a hot knife. Even if they did not die, it was inevitable that their soul fire would be damaged. Brando looked at it and answered seriously, No, Krot, there's no need. According to human customs, the dead should be buried, not to mention that they are brave warriors, warriors of Erewhon. Their souls will belong to Martha, and their bodies will not be desecrated. The undead will also belong to Martha. Krot complained in its heart, but it definitely did not dare to say it out loud. It actually knew about this human custom, but it did not quite understand it, and it was just a subconscious suggestion. In Madara, if such excellent corpses were not turned into undead, it would be seen as a disrespect to the undead moon. So these humans were a little strange to it, of course including Brando. Brando seemed to know what it was thinking and said, Mr. Krot, I know that you are an undead, and your faith belongs to the undead moon. The world of the living is incompatible with you. You are not my subordinate and you do not belong to Erwin. Krot was slightly startled and the soul fire in its eyes flashed. It did not understand what this young man meant by saying this to it. Brando did not care whether it understood or not and continued, "The dark prophecy mentioned that the holder of the Mercury staff will represent the will of the undead moon. It will descend to this world and it will unify the kingdom of darkness. It is the king of the undead and you must submit to it. So I don't want you to betray your king, but I want you to do me a little favor. This favor is related to your life, and I believe that you will not object." Krot nodded cautiously. Of course, it knew that its life was in the hands of this young man, or else the lich from before was the best description. Even without the lich, it did not think that its life was more precious than the Black Knight. If this young man could even kill the Black Knight at all costs, then it was naturally not worth mentioning. However, it did not understand Brando's words. In its opinion, what it was doing now, or rather what it was preparing to do, was in fact betraying His Majesty. Although it now hoped that Brando would not mind this little betrayal, after all, even the holder of the Mercury staff could not be omniscient and omnipotent. As far as it knew, that was the power of the Dark Dragon. You may have some doubts. Brando could see the thoughts of the undead from its flickering soul fire. You only need to know that your Majesty and the Queen of Crows are not really of the same mind. If you create some trouble for the latter, it will not affect the existence you are loyal to, and there may even be some benefits. After all, there is no place for others to sleep on the side of the bed. For Madara, a strong Cruz empire is not a good thing. Your Majesty may be participating in this matter with the intention of benefiting from it. Of course, Brando did not know what the holder of the Mercury staff was thinking. Whether it was in his previous life or now, that mysterious existence was like a mystery to him. For this undead monarch, few players had seen its existence, even the players of Madara. However, the latter's authority was absolutely unquestionable, and it was definitely beyond the existence of all mortal monarchs in this era. However, this kind of power and mystery did not prevent him from tricking Krot into believing in him. Or rather, he knew that the rotten knight in front of him would certainly rather believe in him. Perhaps it had already convinced itself in its heart because the latter was a timid guy. The reason why he said so much was because he hoped that this fellow would not have too many worries. This was because he would need its help in the upcoming operation. In comparison, he did not trust the liches that did not have much wisdom and were blindly loyal to the Mercury staff. Instead, the high-level undead, like Krot, who had a certain level of wisdom and knew how to judge the pros and cons, were much easier to deceive. As long as he could convince them that they were grasshoppers tied to a rope, it would be fine. He glanced at the flickering soul fire in Krot's eyes and knew that his words had worked. He handed the bone staff over to Krot. "We will be heading to the Silver Valley coast. You will be in charge of controlling the undead army. I believe you will know what to do, Mr. Krot." Krot trembled slightly and bowed respectfully. "It is my pleasure to serve you, my respected lord." Chapter 1034. The bell in Fat Tan Port rang continuously. The Roman looked at the priests and believers in golden or red robes walking on the streets, rushing in one direction. That direction was the Forza Square, where the largest temple in Fat Tan Port was located. She stood in the middle of the crowd and did not feel uncomfortable. Instead, it was Haruz who stood behind her, looking a little uneasy. Suddenly, the Roman saw a familiar figure in the crowd. She waved her small white hand in the air excitedly. Mr. Alamov, the middle-aged man in a robe and dressed as a priest, was slightly stunned. He turned around and looked at her with surprise. "Miss Roman?" At this moment, the bell in Fat Tan Port rang, but it was not a simple bell. The bell came from the direction of the Forza Square. Obviously, it was the call of the temple to the believers. As the most senior believer in this city, and also the priest of the neighborhood, Alamov Shadauer put on his holy robe and walked out of the house as soon as the bell rang. However, the teaching position was actually just a part-time job for him. His other identity was the vice president of the Silver Shark Chamber of Commerce in Fat Tan Port. The empire's commerce was prosperous. Most of the empire's merchants, Chamber of Commerce organizations, and business families were closely connected through marriage or other means. Therefore, he had long known and even met the representative of the emerging commercial forces in the south of Erewhon. This beautiful lady was said to be the fiancée of the young lord. In the past year, the rising forces in the south of Erewhon were far more famous in the eyes of the empire's merchants and Chamber of Commerce organizations than they were in the eyes of the empire's traditional nobles. The revival and construction of Tanajil had brought a huge amount of trade to the empire. The empire's handmade products, weapons, and even labor and slaves were transported to the inconspicuous territory in the south of Erewhon. They were then exchanged for precious minerals and raw materials from the Black Forest. After passing through the empire's merchants, they could be exchanged for amazing profits. In the face of the people who created all this, the owner of the territory and its future mistress, who would not be willing to be polite to them. After all, for most people in this world, ideals and beliefs were too far away. Only benefits were the most real and intimate things. Alimov Shadauer was a Roman whom Roland had met at a banquet a few days ago. The banquet was hosted by the eldest son of the emperor, and many nobles and celebrities from the nearby regions were invited. However, most of them were local families and merchants who were inextricably linked to the military aristocracy. Their intentions were self-evident. Hearing Roman's greeting, he stopped and politely asked her, "What's wrong? Is there anything I can help you with, Miss Roman?" "It's nothing." The Roman chuckled. "I just wanted to ask what happened. Why are there so many people? Mr. Alimov, where are you going? Was it because of this?" Alimov was slightly taken aback. He pointed to the steeple of the Holy Cathedral in the direction of Phocea Square and replied, "Did you hear the bell, Miss Roman? This is the bell that summons believers. Something must have happened in the Holy Cathedral. These people are all believers or priests from the nearby area, and they are in a hurry to the Holy Cathedral to see what is going on." "Is it really the bell of the Holy Cathedral? Mr. Alimov, are you sure?" The Roman's dark eyes turned slightly. The Prime Minister's daughter had such a great influence on the Holy Cathedral, but Brando had never mentioned this matter. Didn't they say that the relationship between the Holy Cathedral and the Prime Minister was not very good? "Of course, I'm not joking with you, Miss Roman. This bell is not something that ordinary people can use. It should be the arrival of a senior member of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. If someone else uses this bell to summon believers, I'm afraid he can't bear the responsibility." At this point, Alimov frowned. Fathom Harbor had been closed for a few days. Why would a senior member of the Holy Cathedral arrive at this time? Moreover, this harbor was now under the control of the eldest prince of the Holy Cathedral. What was the meaning of a senior member of the Holy Cathedral arriving at this time? A senior member of the Holy Cathedral? The senior member here should only be someone sent by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Miss Roman. Alimov had some doubts in his heart, but he still answered subconsciously. "I see. Thank you for telling me this, Mr. Alimov." The Roman replied with a smile. Alimov nodded. He was not sure why the future mistress of Tanajul was asking him these questions. Perhaps it was to satisfy her curiosity. After all, there was no contradiction between this and her performance at the banquet. In the eyes of everyone at the banquet, this lady was a lovely, curious, and wonderful person with a very sensitive business sense. The Roman did not ask any more questions. After simply saying goodbye to the head priest, she watched him hurriedly disappear into the crowd. "What about the senior members of the Holy Cathedral, Your Royal Highness?" "Miss Roman? Don't you have any opinion, Your Royal Highness? After all, such complicated matters are not my expertise." She turned around and asked. "It's a little strange. Logically speaking, why would a senior member of the Holy Cathedral come to Fathom Harbor at this time? I heard that the headquarters of the Holy Cathedral of Fire is under the control of the Silver Queen. Why would the eldest prince let Her Majesty the Queen's people into the city?" Although Haruz was a little timid, he was not stupid. He connected these simple reasons with a little thought. "So you also think it's strange?" "Wait, Miss Roman, what are you going to do?" "I think it's strange, of course I'm going to see what's wrong. Brando entrusted me to take care of the rear, so I have to do my best." The Roman answered seriously. "Wait, but..." Haruz was dragged forward by the merchant lady and hurriedly shouted in panic, "But don't we need to inform Lady Yuta and Lady Maynard? Do you think they still need us to inform them?" "This seems like it, but..." "No buts, why are you so long-winded as a man? You should learn more from your teacher. Brando is not like you at all. How can I be compared to my teacher?" Haruz was so anxious that his face turned red. In the sky that was turning from red to purple, silver ships were leaving the sky above Fathom Harbor, sailing in the direction of the sublime inland sea. One by one, they gradually disappeared into the sea fog that filled the harbor. Standing on the bridge of the harbor, Delphian's long purple hair danced in the wind. Judging from her back and her elegant long hair, she could be regarded as a peerless beauty. However, under the fluttering hair was a hideous and terrifying face. Scars from burns crisscrossed her face. One of her eyes was sunken in the depths of her eye socket, as if there was no light at all. Only the spirit contained in the other eye vaguely showed that this face once had a moving charm. She was still sitting in the wheelchair, but the silver dragon lady was nowhere to be seen. At this moment Marjorie was pushing the wheelchair. As for Eugenie, he stood further away. The latter did not seem to be interested in the Prime Minister's daughter at all. He was even very angry about the fact that she let Marjorie push the wheelchair. However, Delphian did not care at all. She stared at the huge fleet in front of her and frowned. Previously, Brando suddenly asked her to send an order for the fleet to sail. The other party must have found an opportunity. This fleet was obviously targeting the White Legion. The young lord from Erewhon seemed to be ready to show his fangs to the Silver Queen. 6 o'clock. What? Eugenie, who was not far away, was confused by her words. What did you say? The time is not right, Delphian replied while staring at the sky. The last fleet left the harbor at 7 o'clock in the morning, but it doesn't look like it's 8 o'clock now. Isn't that the dawn? The dawn is in this direction. That's the sunset. Delphian replied with certainty. That's impossible. It's only been an hour since dawn. The Duke's daughter was shocked. But she suddenly thought of something and blurted out, Is it another solar eclipse? Delphian did not speak. At this time, the sound of the bell in the city finally came from afar. She raised her eyebrows slightly and asked, What bell is that? Eugenie did not seem to care too much about the bell. She was still staring at the golden line on the sea and answered casually, It sounds like the bell of the holy sanctum. No, Delphian frowned and shook her head. This bell? Someone from the holy sanctum has arrived at the headquarters. The headquarters of the holy sanctum? Eugenie was stunned. What do you mean? How can someone from the holy sanctum come here? Marjorie had heard from the Shire that the adoratress of the Leo Palace looked like Sydney. He was about to say something, but the Prime Minister's daughter interrupted him. Marjorie, go and inform the Shire that there's a problem. It's not Lady Sydney. Tell him to be careful and prepare for battle. Marjorie was also stunned. He wondered how she knew that it was not Lady Sydney. But as a professional soldier, he chose to obey the order immediately. I understand, Miss Delphian. Yuta woke up from her coma when she felt the carriage shaking. The light around her was a little dim, as if it was 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. The narrow space looked like the cabin of a large carriage. The dim orange-red sunlight shone in from the outside. It was dusk or early morning. She frowned for a moment, and the pain in her body immediately came back to her. Only then did she remember the previous battle. She thought she was going to die, but Brando arrived as promised. You're awake, sister? Crew's voice came from the side. She turned her head and saw the latter sitting cross-legged with a thick magic book on his knees. Not far from him, near the entrance of the carriage, sat Mare and a few other young people. She subconsciously counted and found that at least half of them were missing. When Mare heard Crew's voice, he turned around and saw the situation here. He saw Yuta's gloomy face and understood what the latter was thinking. It's not bad. Fortunately, the Lord came in time. Otherwise the loss would have been more. Even my lord would have died there. Yuta frowned. Such a heavy loss reminded her of the battle in Abes. My lord, you don't have to blame yourself. I learned in the Royal Knight Academy that there must be blood in war, whether it's us or the enemy. Mare seemed to know what his superior was thinking and advised, the only thing we can do is to make the enemy bleed more than us. But you are so young. My lord, there are adventurers and mercenaries dying in Erewhon at every moment. Some of them are much younger than us. My lord, you used to be a mercenary leader, so I'm sure you're used to it. After hearing Mare's words, not only Yuta, but even Crew became silent. Indeed, they had been in the south for a long time and were used to death. Whether it was in Erewhon, Cruz, or even the 10 cities further away, the adventurers and mercenaries' living conditions were far worse than theirs. As members of the White Lion Guards, they could at least eat their fill. But in the south of Erewhon, many adventurers and mercenaries lived like outlaws, struggling on the verge of starvation and death. At that time, they didn't seem to care much about it. It was just like how Grodon's companions were hanged in Abes castle. At most, it made them angry. They didn't know when these people who lived on the edge of the blade became so sentimental. Mare, what made you sacrifice everything? She suddenly asked in a low voice. Ambition, the young man replied faintly. Sir, you don't understand. A bastard like me is not qualified to inherit the title of nobility. The best way out is to become a knight under a certain important person. From then on, we will be bound together for good or ill. The structure of the kingdom hasn't changed for many years. No matter who I follow, the end result will only be a small piece of land when I'm old or injured. I'll get married and have children. One of my children may encounter some opportunity in the future and become outstanding, but that's not the life I want. My Lord is the only one who can overturn the entire Aween structure. Only by following behind him and participating in all of this will I be able to create a miraculous achievement and change my own fate. I want to prove to everyone that I am the best. Crew was surprised and smacked his lips a few times. He probably didn't expect his inconspicuous companion to have such a long-term dream. In comparison, his biggest dream was to become a real magus, or even more exaggeratedly, if he could reach the level of Master Charles, then he would probably wake up laughing in his sleep. Chapter 1035. The liquid metal, which looked like pure gold, flowed on Brando's palm and changed its shape. It contained a substance similar to light. Milky white light flowed along with the flow of the liquid, like a magnificent diamond of light. Brando stared at this beautiful object. This was the complete form of the law fragment when it was activated. It was the combination of the law of Wand, a part or fragment of the Tiamat code. It was the closest thing to the origin of the world. A product, a supreme creation of the gods. He had never come across such a thing in his previous life. At this moment, his heart was filled with admiration. Putting aside the essence of this thing, just the degree of perfection of the law fragment was enough to make it the supreme of the Wand. A beautiful object. At the moment when the law fragment was activated, Brando understood how to use it. The main function of the law fragment was to construct the law, which was also its original form, the Tiamat code itself. Power. As everyone knew, the world of Wand was chaotic. There was no change of day and night, and there was no cycle of seasons. Perhaps there was still rain, snow, thunder, and lightning, but they did not follow any rules. They were just a manifestation of chaos and disorder. The law fragment created by Martha gave this world the most basic rules. The rising sun in the east, the setting stars in the west, the wind, rain and dew, and even the thunder and lightning. Therefore, the intelligent beings were able to flourish and grow in the land blessed by the goddess. When he received the law fragment, Brando naturally understood a fact, and that was the blessing of the goddess Martha. The law fragment of Tiamat no longer existed in this world. The meteor shower that mortals saw before the eternal night. This was the scene of this huge law fragment falling to the ground. But even though it was broken, the law fragment of Tiamat was still protecting this world. It was as if they were automatically activated by a mysterious force, guarding the different places where they fell. Regions. Could this be the so-called Martha's deepest love for the people of this world? Brando felt the warmth from the law fragment in his hand, and his heart was slightly touched. It felt like a mother's concern for her children. She had no choice but to leave, but she did not let go of her children in this world. Martha had written a final rule in Tiamat's law, which was to give the creatures of the Wand a final chance even if everything was irreversible. However, the fact that the world had been split apart was an unchangeable fact. Brando opened his palm, and the ball of light began to rise slowly. He gave a command to the rule fragment to take back its authority, and spread it all over the surroundings of Fathom Port, from the Golden Needle Forest to the Levia Valley, from the Silver Cove Bay to Ovchin. The laws of the entire southern part of East Metz melted like snow. At Fathom Harbor, the first rays of the morning sun had just risen from the surface of the sea before they were engulfed by darkness in the blink of an eye. The residents in the harbor experienced a spectacle that lasted from dawn to dusk. A layer of gold fragments floated on the surface of the sea as if they were on fire. Delphi, Eugenie, and Marjorie saw with their own eyes that the clouds in the depths of the supreme inland sea were collapsing layer by layer. The sky seemed to have turned into a black hole that swallowed everything. On the dark curtain there were faint glimmers of starlight, but that was not the light of the stars. It was the reflection of the sea of power. 12 moons appeared on the surface of the sea. In the Levia Valley, a group of mountain people had lived on the land that led to the Latch Mountains for generations. The mountain people had erected countless strange wooden sculptures in the forest. It was said that the dark wooden sculptures that were carved with ghosts and monsters were guarding the group of mountain people. In the mountains were the heroic spirits of their ancestors. At this moment, the villagers knelt on the ground in fear. Blurry figures were passing through the forest. Those grayish-white figures seemed to have come from countless eras ago. He was the one who had been there for the past few years. They passed by the pitch-black wood carvings and walked silently into the depths of the forest. In Ovchin, a biting cold wind from the Alkash Mountains passed from the northwest to the southeast. Wherever it passed, everything withered as if winter had arrived in advance. In just an instant the earth was covered in frost. In the city of Ovchin, the town guard stationed at the head of the city witnessed this strange scene with his own eyes. A gust of icy wind whistled from the northwest of the port. It blew over the port, and there was a loud creaking sound that sounded like thousands of pieces of glass cracking at the same time from the direction of the port. The entire sea began to freeze. The ice spread rapidly in the direction of the port and pressed down on the sailboats anchored in the harbor. The wooden hulls of the boats could not bear the weight and shattered. The sailors panicked and jumped off the boats to escape. In the castle not far from the port, a series of icicles quickly hung on the stone window. Behind the stone window, Duke Ambunal watched this scene indifferently. There was no trace of emotion in his grayish-blue eyes. He stretched his deerskin-gloved right hand out of the window. Outside, he wiped away the icicles and watched the broken ice pieces fall with a crisp sound. Outside the window, the sunny sky of the entire southern region of East Metz was dimming layer by layer. It turned from light blue to dark blue, then to a suffocating reddish-purple, and finally to a dark, lusterless darkness. It was as if the sky had been covered by a thick shroud. As the light changed, the candlelight in the room became brighter and brighter. The Duke's thin face revealed a deep outline under the interweaving light and shadows. The shoulders of his military uniform had been piled up with subordinates at some point. Snowflakes drifted in through the window. He turned around and held a bone staff in his left hand. This bone staff was very strange. It didn't look like it was made of human bone or any familiar animal bone. The bone staff was dark red, and its surface was covered with a layer of the bone staff was covered in scaly patterns, and at the top was a huge claw. It clasped a skull tightly. The skull was not human either. It was a size smaller than a human skull. The bone was pitch black and had 3 eyes. In fact, this was a scorched hell demon. The skull of a demon. Duke Ambunal held the bone staff in his hand and shook off the snow on his body. He said to the mayor of Ovchin, Count Breyer, who was in the room, "It seems that Her Majesty did not lie to us. This world is no longer the one we know. This is a world. Under the calm surface, there is a deep disaster brewing. Before this, who would have thought that the Wraith Banshee was telling the truth? It seems that she has succeeded. Next, let our army of the undead set out." Count Breyer was a humorous middle-aged man. He had a deep personal relationship with Duke Ambunal. When he heard this sentence, even under the terrible scene in front of him, he could not help but joke. "You call this situation calm? My old friend, I'm afraid there is no one in the entire empire who is calmer than you." However, he still shook his head. He looked at the bone staff in Duke Ambunal's hand and said, "But I still don't believe in the undead of Madara. They are not on the same side as us. Old friend, do you really believe that they will be so kind? And the point is, if we go with the undead of Madara, it will leave a bad reputation. The other holy shrines may unite against us. This is the decree of Her Majesty." Duke Ambunal replied quietly. He took off his gloves and put his right index finger on the top of the bone staff. 2 balls of red light shone from the pitch-black skulls. Silver Bay Coast. The place had long been shrouded in the howling icy wind. The sunny scene of the southern coast of East Metz had disappeared. Even the vast sea was covered with a thick layer of ice. The waves were frozen at the last moment, forming layers upon layers. Glaciers that looked like mountain peaks, looking south along the frozen coast, formed a grayish-blue frost plain at the end of the horizon. The biting cold icy wind mixed with the snowflakes that filled the sky. Palm-sized snowflakes fell from the sky in layers, quickly forming a foot-deep pile of snow on the ground. The world was covered in a vast expanse of whiteness, as if it had covered all life. But under the snow, some existences that did not belong to this world were awakening. With a muffled sound, an undead shrouded in a tattered black cloak suddenly crawled out from under the snow. The red light of the 2 soul fires under its black cloak was particularly eye-catching. As soon as it came to the ground, the undead immediately raised its bone staff. Raising the bone staff in his hand, a forest of withered bones rose from the snow in an instant. It was a group of skeleton soldiers. The undead shook off the snow on their bodies and crawled out of the snow one by one. It was as if in an instant there was a Mimi. In an instant, an army of death appeared in this world out of thin air. In Wayne, Ovchin, on the main road leading to Fathan, countless similar scenes were playing out over and over again. Ground dragons of the White Legion rampaged in the snowy night. On their saddles sat black-robed undead wizards or necromancers, accompanied by more than 10 White Legion knights or soldiers, holding ambunal in their hands. The fake bone staff in Duke Lear's hand led an army of undead under the night sky. And every undead army had only one destination. That was Fathan Harbor. But in the Golden Needle Forest, it was a different scene. The bone staff in the hands of the decaying knight Krot was also emitting a red light, but at this moment she did not have the mind to pay attention to the changes of the bone staff in her hand, because in the sky above the forest, there was a more spectacular scene. A scene. The radiance of the entire world seemed to have been sucked into the ball of light in the air. Hundreds of millions of golden threads of law flew over from all directions and gathered here. The ball of light hanging above the forest looked very much like a ball of light at this moment. The eternal small sun was rising slowly above the forest canopy. The valley and the forest were bathed in the dazzling light, even turning the forest into a silver-white color. Everyone who witnessed this scene, not only Krot but even the young men under Yuta, was stunned. They looked at Brando, who was holding the light ball with one hand, in awe. They were inexplicably shocked, especially Kilo. At this moment, the decaying knight was looking at Brando with uncertainty. As an undead who was more sensitive to the power of life, he could clearly feel the strong life emitted by the light ball more clearly than anyone else. Power, that kind of power, was almost endless. Just 1/10,000th of it was enough to turn him, no, not only him but even the undead army under his control, into ashes. He did not know how Brando mastered such terrifying power, but there was no doubt that this young lord from Erwin had already been listed as one of the people he could not afford to offend. If he had some other thoughts in his heart before, at this moment he was only willing to serve Brando. Thinking of this, the dark noble from Madara could not help but bow more respectfully. On the other hand, Jana, who was under the roof of the carriage, finally discovered the abnormality outside the carriage. She fell into silence after hearing Mir's words. Then she recalled the reason why she joined the mercenary group in the first place. This small group was definitely not as ambitious as the youth in front of him. Perhaps it was just to protect themselves, and then there was a bit of admiration for Brendel, as well as respect and gratitude towards his grandfather. As for the future, she did not think too much. In fact, ever since her sister died, she rarely thought about such unrealistic things. But after this battle, she found that everything seemed to be slightly different. She could not tell where this difference came from, but when she saw the sword firmly inserted in her scabbard, the emblem of the white lion on the hilt, and the coat of arms on her breastplate, everything seemed to have an answer. At this time, a strong light suddenly rose outside the carriage. Yuta was slightly stunned and could not help but look in that direction. Where is this place? What's going on outside? This is still the Golden Needle Forest. We are moving in the direction of the Silver Bay coast, Crew replied. As for what's going on outside, I'm afraid you'll have to ask the Lord. Yuta frowned but did not immediately go out. Instead she asked, How long have I been unconscious? Not long. My lord, your injuries are quite serious, but under the effect of the holy water, you recovered quickly. It has only been 7 or 8 hours since yesterday. Mare replied. 7 or 8 hours, then it should be early in the morning now? Yuta was slightly stunned. But why did I feel like it was dusk just now? I thought I was unconscious for the whole day? You can say that. Crew continued. According to the Lord, from now on, the time of a normal person is meaningless to us. He's right. From now on, in the Eastern Metz region, day and night, and even time itself, are meaningless. You might see some strange things later, but don't worry about it. I suggest that you get used to this situation before you prepare for battle. Brendel's voice sounded from outside the carriage. He's right. From now on, in the Eastern Metz region, day and night, and even time itself, are meaningless. You might see some strange things later, but don't mind it. My lord? Yuta asked in confusion. What does that mean? Nothing, Brando replied. You only need to know that a long, long time ago, we called this world the world of Evernight. Here, Martha's laws are no longer applicable. Chapter 1036. Many believers had already gathered in the Forza Square. As the sky suddenly darkened, the scene was shrouded in a layer of uneasiness. Butter torches were lit in the square, and the light of the flames intertwined, illuminating the whole square. The crowd gathered around and whispered to each other. Most people thought that there was another solar eclipse, but the frequent solar eclipses were still not a good sign, so many people had a worried look on their faces. The gate of the temple was closed, and the huge arch was dyed with a dense dark color, like an overly serious religious painting. There were a few low-level monks in gray robes on the stairs, but no one came out to announce what had happened and why the bell was rung. Roman walked through the crowd with Haruz. The Forza Sanctum was a famous historical site in Fathan Port. Before this, she had visited it with Chiara and the elf once and happened to know that there was a secret back door in the sanctum. The two quickly bypassed the crowd and sneaked into the sanctum through the back door without anyone noticing. The back door was locked, but it was not a problem for a witch. Roman used metal melting to open the door, but accidentally caught fire, which scared the two. In the end, they hurriedly put out the fire, only to find that more than half of the door had been burned. In order to destroy the evidence, she had to ask Haruz to take down the door and hide it, which wasted a lot of time. There was a long corridor behind the back door, but there was no one at the moment. This discovery made Roman feel relieved. She tiptoed through the corridor with the little prince, and just as she turned a corner, she saw a bright light in front of her. In the dark sanctum, there was a bright hall in front of her. This discovery made her very excited, but then she found that there were monk soldiers guarding outside the hall, and her pair of small eyebrows suddenly wrinkled. Seeing this, Haruz subconsciously felt a little nervous. His first reaction was to retreat, but immediately Brando's daily teaching finally had some effect. He calmed himself down and gestured to Roman with his hand. "Miss Roman, do you want me to lead them away?" The young prince compared his strength with that of the other party. Although his swordsmanship was not up to standard, his magic was already at the basic level. The two soldier monks guarding the door were only at the level of black iron. He was confident that he could win, so he cautiously made this suggestion. "No need." The Roman waved his hand generously. "You're Brando's student. I can't let you take the risk. Watch me." She thought for a moment and chose a dream spell from the witchcraft she had mastered. This spell was very similar to the dust of sleep of the law magic, or the hypnotism of the elemental magic. However, the witch's spells had their own strengths. They were mysterious and difficult to detect. Their spells affected the real world through the kingdom of dreams, causing people to unknowingly fall into an illusion. The Roman muttered something and pointed at the soldier monks guarding the entrance of the hall. The two soldier monks froze at the same time, then lowered their heads and fell into a peaceful sleep. Seeing that her spell was a success, she clenched her fist excitedly. There was no problem. According to White Mist, as the inheritor, Miss Merchant had high attainments in witchcraft, but she was always absent-minded and forgetful when learning witchcraft. When she cast spells, there would often be some unexpected accidents. For example, misreading the incantation, misremembering the trigger bite, these were all common occurrences. There was even one time when she remembered the incantation of a spell as another spell, which was unprecedented. Dream spell was a level 5 spell. The Roman could only cast similar spells 3 times a day. After casting it once, the merchant girl's face immediately paled. However, she did not mind. She immediately turned around and waved at Cruz excitedly, motioning for him to hurry up and follow her. The two came to the door of the hall. The soldier monks on both sides were under the spell and were sleeping soundly. They did not seem to notice the arrival of the uninvited guests. The Roman seemed to be very confident in her spell and did not even look at the two soldier monks. Haruz, on the other hand, was more careful. He carefully observed for a while before letting out a sigh of relief and looked away. The two looked into the hall again. This hall was the main hall of the Fossa Basilica. The Flame King Gretel's holy statue was erected in the hall. Under the statue was the altar, surrounded by layers of prayer seats. At this moment, the hall was brightly lit, and a fiery red portal appeared on the altar. The Roman vaguely felt that this portal was similar to the door of flame she saw in Ampere Seal, but it was much smaller. The host of the Fossa Basilica, Father Jorf, was standing respectfully beside the portal. Next to him stood a priest who seemed to be of higher status, lecturing him. In addition, there were many low-level monks standing around, and Roman even saw Alamov among them. The merchant girl was a little excited to see an old acquaintance she had met not long ago. She wanted to wave and say hello, but fortunately Haruz was quick enough to grab her sleeve and not let her go. "Sister Roman, I think it's best if we don't show ourselves before we understand the situation," the young prince whispered as he wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. He also quickly changed the way he addressed her. "Besides, we snuck in secretly." "That's true." The Roman slapped her forehead and realized. At this moment, the voice of admonishment came from the hall without missing a single word. "Father Jorf, Lady Sydney has betrayed the basilica. According to the information we received, she is likely to arrive at Fathom Port soon and collude with the eldest prince." "What?" Father Jorf was shocked. He naturally knew who the adoratress of the Leo Palace was. She was known as the most powerful person under the Holy See. How could she betray the basilica? His first reaction was disbelief. His second reaction was to realize that the rumors about the basilica's split were true. However, he still did not know what exactly happened. Although the empire was in a civil war, in reality the internal strife of the basilica had not surfaced yet. After all, the Silver Queen's purge of the basilica was limited to the upper echelons of the basilica. She had not even issued any orders to the other parishes. These things were too far away for Jorf. Not to mention Sydney, he had only heard of the person in front of him before today. My lord, this is... You don't have to worry. This is the will of Her Majesty and the Holy See. Jorf heaved a sigh of relief. Then what should we do, my lord? The White Legion will launch an attack on Fathom Port in a few days. Those who conspire against the basilica will be doomed. However, Sydney is likely to secretly use means to let the basilica participate in this war. She may even stand on the opposite side of Her Majesty and the Holy See. Your task is to stabilize the believers and low-level monks. Don't let them be deceived by that woman. I understand, my lord. I have gathered the believers according to your instructions. Shall I go and inform them now? Of course. The man nodded in satisfaction. Eowyn's undead army should already be on their way. As these undead that had been summoned were relatively low-level undead, they should be most afraid of the priests and ascetics of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the city when they launched a sneak attack on Fathom Port. However, as long as the forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the city were not organized immediately, they would be able to play the greatest role in this battle. With these unexpected undead, coupled with the Hill Dwellers and the White Legion, the balance of this war was firmly in Her Majesty's favor. Father Yalford did not suspect anything. He turned around and was about to order the low-level monk beside him to open the door. Although he was the highest-ranking priest in Fathom Port, he was still a low-level monk in the huge Holy Cathedral of Fire. He was not aware of the power struggle behind the scenes. As a member of the hierarchical organization of the Holy Cathedral, his first priority was of course to obey the orders from the headquarters of the Holy Cathedral. He was already familiar with this important person in front of him. Moreover, this person had arrived from the Door of Flame on the altar. The latter was one of the top secrets of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. As a member of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it went without saying what a person who could open the Door of Flame represented. However, when she saw the low-level monk leave Yalford's side and walk towards the main door of the Holy Cathedral, Roman did not realize that there was a problem. Haruz, who was beside her, said anxiously to her, "Miss Roman, you can't let them open the main door. If they control the believers and low-level priests in Fathom Port, the teachers will be in a disadvantageous position." Is that so? Roman's small eyebrows suddenly raised. These guys dare to trick Brando, how despicable. After saying that, she pointed her finger at the main door of the Holy Cathedral. The low-level monk who was walking towards the door was ordering the monk soldiers to remove the bolt on the door and was ready to open the two heavy wooden doors. However, before they could reach out, a huge human face suddenly appeared on the door. The human face opened its eyes and glanced at everyone in the hall. Then it suddenly said, "Hey guys, your luck is pretty good. You actually found this door that leads to the treasure. Do you want to get the treasure through me? No problem as long as you can answer my riddle." The loud voice echoed throughout the hall. Everyone who witnessed this scene was stunned, including Roman and the young Prince Haruz. Haruz stared at the spell cast by the merchant lady, while Roman's mouth formed an O shape. "Oh my, isn't this the door sealing spell? I say, what's wrong with you guys? Don't you have any interest in the legendary treasure?" The human face on the door was still chattering, but at this time Yalfo and the big shot beside him had reacted. "Activate the object, catch the witch." The big shot beside Yalfo saw Roman and Haruz hiding behind the side door at a glance. He roared, "Don't let her escape." Everyone turned their eyes in this direction. Among the crowd, Alamov saw Roman and Haruz and could not help but be stunned. Yalfo naturally did not remember the little girl who came to the Holy Cathedral a few days ago. He reacted immediately, pointed his finger, and a holy cage enveloped Roman and Haruz. However, before the spell could get close to the two, a transparent shield suddenly opened up on Haruz's body. In an instant, Yalfo's holy spell was cancelled out. Seeing this scene, Yalfo could not help but be stunned, but the big shot beside him reacted. "Immune to spell control? This is the new moon ring, the Erwin royal family? Catch the little boy, I want him alive." At this time, the low-level monks and soldier monks in the hall had already swarmed up. Haruz's face turned pale when he saw this scene. He could not help but tremble. "Miss Roman, what should we do?" "Run, of course." Roman was confused but not stupid. She grabbed Haruz's collar and ran back quickly. The two ran through the dark corridor in a panic and were about to reach the corner. Roman certainly knew that behind the corner was the back door of the Holy Cathedral. As long as they reached the back and went around to the square, there would be a sea of people there, and the enemy would definitely not be able to do anything to them. However, it was not that simple. There were even silver-ranked guards in the Holy Cathedral. Although her strength was not inferior to a silver-ranked warrior, she was only a witch after all. In terms of physical fitness, she was far inferior to a silver-ranked warrior. The soldier monks and monks behind her were getting closer and closer. Roman felt that her heart was about to jump out of her throat. She was nervous and excited. In front of her was the previous corner. Roman grabbed Haru's collar and turned around the corner. Before she could react, she felt that she had bumped into something. She groaned and felt that her head was buried in something soft. She hurriedly took a step back with her eyes wide open, but she felt that her wrist had been grabbed. Ah! This gave Roman a big fright, and he hurriedly raised his head, only to discover that the person who had grabbed him was a beautiful female priestess. The other party was extremely tall, with a head of short platinum hair. Her brows were tightly knitted, and a pair of golden eyes were staring at him. Her face was full of majesty and heroic spirit. Although Roman did not recognize the rank of the robe of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, she realized that the lady in front of her was of high status. She had seen the priest who presided over the Holy Cathedral of Fossa before, and his robe was far less gorgeous than the one in front of her. Other than being clean and tidy, even the big shot of the Holy Cathedral of Fire could not compare to the one in front of her. However, she was a little nervous under the other party's stare. She subconsciously pulled her hand back, but the hand that grabbed her wrist seemed to be cast in steel and did not move at all. "You're hurting me?" Roman whispered guiltily. "Roman is not a thief. Can you let us go first?" But at this time, another slightly hollow voice sounded, "Miss Roman, why are you here?" Roman and Haruz were stunned when they heard this voice. They looked up in surprise and found that there was another person behind the priest. It was a female knight shrouded in pale flames. "Lady Brunhilde." The young prince cried out in surprise, "Why are you here?" Chapter 1037. The earth was covered in ice and snow, and all living things were lifeless. The darkness seemed to be desolate, and only the occasional flash of lightning in the distant horizon could bring a trace of light to this pitch-black world. At the moment when the lightning lit up the world, a skeleton could be seen. The skeletons moved forward in this gray snowy land, approaching from far to near, covering the entire snowfield. The electric light was quickly extinguished, leaving only the light of the soul fire in the darkness, as if it was an illusion left in the field of vision. In the carriage, Jana was watching this scene silently. The undead army was crossing paths with them. This was the fifth wave of undead she had seen in such a short time, but this wave was much larger than any of the previous ones. There seemed to be an endless number of them on the snowy plains. There were tens of thousands of them. There was also a strange sound in the sky. This sound could be hidden from others but not from her. It was the sound of skeletal vultures flapping their wings. There were so many of them that she could even imagine the scene of them covering the sky and covering the sun as they flew overhead. The undead army was like a torrent, enough to swallow all living things in their path. But this small undead army they were in did not attract any attention in this torrent. The necromancers in the undead army did not even look at them. In the moment when the lightning lit up the earth, Yuta had seen a necromancer. The necromancer looked no different from the low-level necromancers they had seen in the War of the Black Rose, but the bone staff in his hand was particularly different. These bone staffs looked like they were made of demon bones, and each of them looked exactly the same. They were also exactly the same as the one in the hands of the rotten knight Krot beside Brando. Yuta silently assessed and found that the number of necromancers among the undead army was far less than expected. How did these necromancers control this army? She had already keenly linked it to these strange bone staffs. Of course, Yuta did not know that she had almost guessed the truth. At the same time, Brando was also looking at the bone staff in Krot's hand. It should be a replica of the Treasure of Darkness. If he guessed correctly, the original in Duke Ambuner's hand should be exactly the same as this one. According to Haku, the Treasure of Darkness was actually created using the power of the Orb of Darkness. He could faintly feel that the bone staff in Krot's hand was emitting a gloomy and cold energy. This kind of energy was incompatible with the aura of the living. When he held the bone staff in his hand earlier, he had a very strong feeling, but he didn't expect that he could still feel that kind of energy even after the bone staff was far away from him. The power was resonating with him. Brando slightly knitted his brows. Of course, he wasn't an undead, but he knew that a very high concentration of Dark God's blood flowed in his body. Now, he already knew that this Dark God's blood was the power of the so-called Dark Pearl, and the power of the Dark Treasure was also born from this. Could it be that in the hands of these liches? The replica was actually not as simple as a replica, but a fragment of the treasure of darkness. Was that why it could resonate with the dark god's blood in his body? He was very suspicious of this in his heart, but he didn't have the chance to confirm this suspicion for the time being. At this moment, the bone staff was in the hands of the rotten knight. Krot used the special power of the bone staff to conceal the aura of all the living around it. If it wasn't for this, the surrounding undead army would have already discovered their existence. Brando himself had touched the elemental realm, so he could conceal his aura at any time. However, Yuta and her young subordinates were completely exposed. "They're heading towards Fathom Harbor, my lord," Yuta said weakly after observing the undead army for a while. Brando nodded, indicating that he understood. "Don't we have to do anything?" "We can't do anything even if we want to. There are at least 30 to 40,000 ribs here, and there should be more behind," Brando replied. "That's true. The fleet at Fathom Harbor is enough to annihilate them. Where are we going, my lord?" Brando thought that she might not know that there were no more fleets at Fathom Harbor. Tanagel's fleet had already left the harbor before they entered the Evernight continent. However, he didn't plan to tell them the truth, lest they think too much. Anyway, there was no point in telling them the truth, and it would only increase their psychological burden. It was just a burden. He only replied faintly, "You'll know in a while." After a short conversation, the carriage returned to silence. This carriage was actually an undead, and the carriage was made of bones. The animals pulling the carriage were also 4 undead warhorses. This was originally the Lich's carriage, so naturally it was now theirs. The undead carriage moved forward slowly in the snow. Time seemed to be meaningless in this dark world. Mare held a silver-plated pocket watch in his hand, and the hands of the watch were sometimes fast and sometimes slow, and sometimes it would even turn backwards. They saw a withered pine tree in the snow, and it experienced the whole process of growing from a sapling to a towering tree, and then withered to death. This scene repeated itself in this dark world, and after a while they became used to it. At this time, Yuta and the others finally understood what Brando meant when he said that time was meaningless in this world. Half an hour later they encountered the 4th wave of undead, and this wave was about the same size as the 3rd wave. 15 minutes later they encountered the 5th wave of undead, and this wave was slightly smaller than the previous 2 waves, but there were still more than 10,000 of them. After that they didn't encounter any more undead, but when they approached the coast of the Silver Valley, Krot's undead army met a Cruz army head-on. Brando saw it from afar. He saw the flag on the opposite side. It was Cruz's White Legion, and it seemed that they were the vanguard of the White Legion. This Cruz army had about 3,000 to 4,000 people, which was not as large as any of the previous undead armies, but it was much stronger. In front of Cruz's army was the Earth Dragon Knight, and behind them was the heavily armed garrison infantry. The spears in the hands of the infantry were 3 to 4 meters long, and the black steel spearheads shone under the light of the torches. They were fully armored, and even their faces were covered. The garrison infantry was the main force of the White Legion's infantry. Their average strength was between the lower and middle silver level. Once they formed a spear formation, even a gold-level knight regiment would find it difficult to defeat them head-on. Behind them were the projectile troops, and most of them were crossbowmen and longbowmen recruited from the East Metz region. Although they didn't have any special abilities, their average strength was at least lower silver level. This is the strength of the Kurlutz Empire's frontline legions. Even though Valhalla seems to be flourishing, I don't think I can defeat any of the frontline legions with my current strength. Even the irregular legions would find it difficult to win against them. Perhaps. Yuta and the others didn't have any idea, but Brando, who had experienced the strength of the Empire in his previous life, knew all too well. He could kill a team of Earth Dragon Knight effortlessly, and Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles could do the same or even better. But what was the result? In fact, his famous teacher in history was also hunted down by the Empire and had nowhere to hide. After reaching the pinnacle of the law or even stepping into the extreme planes, an individual's strength could reach a terrifying level. They could even change the course of a war and become a strategic force of a country. But that didn't mean that after reaching that level, an individual could rival a country, let alone the Cruz Empire. After all, although there weren't many people who had stepped into the extreme realm, there were still a few in the Empire. Silently watching the Cruz Empire's army approach, Yuta and the others in the carriage also fell silent. The gap between the White Lion Guards and this terrifying army was obvious. For the current White Lion Guards, the average strength of the NCOs and elites could barely reach silver level, but most of the soldiers were still in the iron rank. Compared to the White Legion, whose average strength was in the middle to lower silver level, and whose NCOs and knights were above gold level, there was a difference of a whole level. And this was only the White Lion Guards. If the White Lion Legion in the north and the other legions of the kingdom were compared to the White Legion, there was no comparison. If the current White Lion Guards and the White Legion were like the difference between the reserves and the regular army, then the other legions were like the inferior bandits and bandits. They were not even soldiers or guards. Facing such an army, even with the addition of the Buga fleet, the chances of winning were at most 50%. After all, the ones controlling the fleet were the Erewhon people, whose average strength was weaker, and the high-level wizards in the fleet were far from enough. According to Yuta and the others' knowledge, each of the 4 major legions of the Empire, each of them had their own exclusive air force. Brando glanced at the silent female mercenary leader and her young men and guessed what they were thinking, but he did not intend to comfort them. Sometimes it was good to let them recognize the gap between them. The demonic wave was affecting the world, and from this moment on, everyone would have the same opportunity. Only by recognizing the gap between them would they have the motivation to catch up. The vanguard of the White Legion quickly approached. The Drake Knight in front of them was the first to discover the undead army. They immediately left the group and rushed in this direction. It was not until they were a short distance away that the Drake Knight stopped and questioned Krot loudly. "Don't reply," Brendel whispered, "and don't expose our existence." Brendel stopped him immediately. "Don't answer," Brendel whispered, "and don't expose our presence." No problem? Krot was a little scared. Although she was an undead, she was not brainless. Of course, she could see the difference between the quality of the two armies. Although she had thousands of skeletons under her command, if they really fought, the small team of Drake Knight would probably be able to effortlessly slaughter them all. The power of the Roman Black Rose was not based on the millions of skeletal warriors. In the War of the Undead, the real masters were the powerful undead such as the Black Knight, the humorous WRM, and the Lich. Brando nodded slowly. He had already observed that the previous undead army should be directly controlled by the Treasure of Darkness. If Krot showed too much autonomy, it might arouse the suspicion of the other party. Now the best thing for them to do was to move forward. These Crew's Knight must be rushing to the front line. They were now just doing routine questioning. As long as Krot did not do anything threatening, the other party would not have too much of a reaction. After all, who would have thought that there was an undead army that was not under Ambunal's control going in the opposite direction to Ovchin at this time? In this plan, the Erewhon people in Fedan Port should not even know about the existence of the undead. Yuta, Mare, and the others retreated into the carriage. The undead carriage was shrouded in a thick death aura. Moreover, it was quite far away, so they did not have to worry about being discovered by the other party. There was another world in the carriage. Krot listened to Brando's instructions without saying a word. She controlled the undead army to pass by the vanguard of the White Legion. After that, the Drake Knight followed behind the undead army from afar, maintaining a distance that was neither too far nor too close. As expected, they did not ask any more questions. They only turned back when the two armies passed by each other. It was only then that everyone in the carriage breathed a sigh of relief. Yuta could not help but look at Brando with some admiration. She did not know the secret of the bone staff. She only thought that Brando was very calm in the face of danger, just like his grandfather. Not long after that, they encountered the main forces of the White Legion one after another. However, the two situations were not too different. After all, no one would have thought that there would be a rebel army in the undead army. Most of the people in Cruz thought that this undead army was one of the many undead armies that were wandering around Ovchin. However, humans were not used to dealing with the undead. In fact, most of the officers of the White Legion did not know the details of the deal between Her Majesty and Madara. Therefore, they did not know what role these undead played in the whole plan. Especially for most of the higher-ups of the White Legion, they still subconsciously thought that the deal with Madara was something that should not be exposed to the public. Therefore, the plan itself was very secretive. In the end, most of the officers of the White Legion did not know where the undead were deployed. They only knew that the undead would cooperate with them to attack Fatten Harbor. This greatly facilitated Brando and the others. In less than 2 hours, Krot and her undead subordinates had passed through several lines of defense and arrived near Ovchin. At this moment, the whole world was dark, but Ovchin City was still brightly lit. Looking from afar at the coast of the Silver Valley, the harbor was like a bright star embedded in the dark horizon. P.S. In yesterday's chapter, there were a few places where Haruz was written as Cruz. I didn't notice. Odiel. Chapter 1038. Sydney, you've come to walk right into the trap. A slightly serious voice echoed in the hall of the Forza Basilica. 2 more people had appeared in the hall, and the one who spoke was one of them. The priest who had reprimanded Yalfo earlier was now standing respectfully behind the man with another unfamiliar face. The man was about 40 or 50 years old, wearing a holy robe that was almost the same style as Sidney's. He was slightly bald and fat. In fact, this man was Roderick, the sixth of the 11 sanctums. Roderick Barbarossa was born in a scholastic family in Cloak Bay. When he was young, he was favored by the previous generation's great priest, Bishop Mekiuri of Cloak Bay. Later, he was promoted to the upper echelons of the sanctum and was known for his hymns. He once attacked the cultists in Ambroli and was mercilessly awarded the title of Iron Bishop. After returning to the center of the sanctum, he entered the core of the power of the 11 sanctums. He looked very young, but in fact he was not much younger than Vala. But Sidney did not even lift his eyelids to look at him, as if he was too lazy to speak. She looked in the direction of the altar, where the door of flame had disappeared without a trace. It was obvious that this was a trap waiting for her to come here. She was not surprised at all that the Silver Queen knew that she would come here. When she escaped from the Leo Palace, she took the fragment of holy sword Oderfeis with her. It would be strange if the Silver Queen could not even guess that. Roman and Haruz stood nervously behind the statue of the Leo Palace's adoratress, while Brunhilde was guarding them. She looked a little indifferent. Brando had ordered her to send Sidney to Fathom Harbor with the Windrider Foal. As for the fight between these mortals, she did not care much, and Sidney did not ask her for help. Probably angered by the indifference of Sidney and Brunhilde, the great priest Roderick raised his eyebrows, and a faint anger rose in his heart. Although he was the sixth of the 11 sanctums, his real strength was not too far from Sidney's. In fact, among the 11 sanctums, except for Vala's extraordinary strength, the others were actually on par with each other. And now he had the help of 2 high-ranking priests from the scholastic faction, so he really did not know where Sidney's confidence came from. Was it because of that woman? Roderick glanced at Brunhilde and saw that this Valkyrie was at most at the level of elemental enlightenment. As for Roman and Haruz, he simply ignored them. Thinking of this, Roderick felt a little more confident. He didn't want to complicate matters, so he immediately ordered the 2 beside him and Yalfo, "Stop her together. Don't let her escape. My lord, that little boy should be the crown prince of Erewhon." At this moment, the high priest beside Yalford suddenly spoke. Roderick looked at Haruz with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He nodded silently and replied, "Don't worry about him. They can't run away. Just keep an eye on Sidney." Although the voices of the 2 were not loud, it was impossible for Sidney not to hear them with her strength. However, she acted as if she did not hear them and stood there motionlessly, as if she was going to watch Roderick make his move. Her attitude angered the holy eulogist from the center of the holy cathedral. Roderick let out a cold snort from his nose and chanted in a low voice, "Supreme Flame, my Lord King. Please forgive the folly of the mortal world, send down your holy judgment, sweep away all evil and darkness." A sacred light hung down from the dome of the holy cathedral and enveloped him in it. He spread out his hands and the light spread in all directions like a cage, enveloping Sidney in it. If Brando were here at this moment, he would be surprised to recognize this spell. This was one of the 74 sacred hymns of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Hymns were one of the most powerful holy spells of the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and each of the 74 hymns was a powerful holy spell. They were both judgment and truth, containing unimaginable power. The spells of the gods that mortals spoke of were, in fact, the spells of hymns. Furthermore, hymns were Roderick's forte. Among the 74 hymns there were long ones and short ones. Among them, the admonition hymn, which was known as the strongest holy spell of imprisonment, seal and boundary, had 144 lines. An ascetic with profound teachings would be able to perform this holy spell in a short 7 lines. However, Roderick's first move was a shocking 4-line hymn. In this field alone, he could be said to be standing at the peak of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Perhaps no one, including Vala, could be compared to him. At the same time as Roderick cast the spell, the 2 scholastic masters beside him flanked Sidney at the same time. They each took out a scepter with a cross head. This was the cross scepter of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, a very powerful holy weapon, and also a symbol of their status. Bishops of their level were usually called Bishops of the Cross. In the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the strength of the Bishops of the Cross was usually between elemental activation and elemental enlightenment, depending on the individual's strength. In most areas, the level of the Bishops of the Cross was actually not at this level, so most of the Bishops of the Cross were actually scholars who were very knowledgeable in holy spells and religious knowledge. Being attacked by, praise the Saint Roderick and 2 scholarly scholars at the same time, There was probably no one in the Holy Temple other than the Supreme Vala who could escape unscathed. But at this moment, Sidney didn't seem to feel the slightest bit of danger. He just stood there quietly, staring at the two scholarly masters and Roderick's holy spell with a cold and disdainful gaze. Is he crazy? Roderick looked at the scene in disbelief. Of course, he did not think that he could casually use a spell to injure the chief priest of the Leo Palace. Not to mention him, perhaps even Vala, the Great Holy See, could not do so. After all, Sidney's combat strength was second only to Vala among the 11 Holy Seas. There was a legend in the Empire it was said that the Saintess of the Leo Palace was very talented in battle. When she was young she could have joined the Flame Knight Regiment, but she chose to walk the path of a monk. As one of the 11 Holy Seigneurs, Roderick knew that this legend wasn't groundless, but rather it was true. Back then, Sidney had actually caught the eye of the previous generation's Grand Commander of the Knights, who wanted to personally appoint her as his successor. However, Sidney herself had opposed it, and with the protection of Vala and the previous generation's great holy seigneurs, this matter was left unsettled. This woman was born to be a knight. Even if she later embarked on the path of a bishop, her fighting style was the most powerful among the 11 Holy Seas. But no matter how powerful she was, it was impossible for Sidney to stand still and take his spell head-on. What did she think he was, one of those low-level high-ranking priests? However, in the next moment Roderick felt that he was really crazy. He saw that his spell had not yet touched Sidney's body, and it broke into pieces like glass, turning into countless dust and dissipating with the wind. At that moment Roderick almost thought that he was hallucinating. This was a hymn, one of the most powerful among the 74 hymns. How could she break his spell without moving? Could it be that the woman in front of him was actually Vala in disguise? Roderick immediately threw this crazy idea out of his mind. Not to mention that the great Holy See Vala was now under house arrest by Her Majesty the Queen. Even if it was Vala himself, it was impossible for him to stand still and break his spell. Roderick suddenly thought of a terrible possibility in his mind. But before he could react, Sidney in front of him finally made a move. The Lion Palace Saintess raised her right hand and pointed at him. It was the simplest third circle holy spell, Ray of Radiance. A white light shot out from Sidney's fingertips and went straight to the praise the Saint Roderick. This holy spell was quite popular among the low-level priests because it was the most effective attack method below the fourth circle. However, in a battle at the level of the Holy See, this spell was tantamount to a joke. Not to mention that Roderick had countless means to counter this spell. In fact, even if he did not react and let this spell hit him, this mere third circle spell may not be able to break through his will barrier. At this moment, Roderick felt an extremely dangerous aura from this spell. In an instant he set up 3 or 4 protective spells around himself. As if he was afraid that he could not block this third circle spell, he desperately retreated. In the next moment, under the watchful eyes of everyone in the hall, a terrible scene happened. This simple ray of light was like the legendary Holy Spear. It actually pierced through all the protective spells in front of Roderick. Under everyone's shocked gaze, the white ray of light did not trigger the praise the Saint Roderick's will barrier at all. It easily pierced his fat body and pierced his heart. One of the 11 Holy Seas of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the praise the Saint Roderick, widened his eyes as if he could not believe that he would die so easily. Then endless darkness shrouded his consciousness. When Roderick's body fell to the ground, it suddenly burst into flames in an instant as if it was swallowed by the holy fire. The whole hall was silent, and no one reacted for a moment. Including the countless monks present, including Jorf and the 2 scholastic masters. The 2 scholastic masters had stopped in their tracks. They looked at Sidney, the saintess of the Leo Palace, as if they had seen a ghost. For a moment they could not advance or retreat. Should they continue to attack? This was obviously not a wise choice, but if they wanted to escape, where could they escape to? How strong was Roderick? Even he had been reduced to ashes by a mere third circle spell, let alone them. But after all, the 2 of them were monks with profound attainments in doctrine. Soon they thought of the possibility that Roderick thought of before he died. Their faces changed at the same time, and at the same time they looked at the indifferent Sidney. But this time Sidney did not look at them at all. She directly said to all the low-level monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the hall, "Immediately open the door and gather everyone. I want to speak." Yalfo seemed to have just reacted. He looked at Roderick's ashes on the ground in disbelief, and then looked at Sidney. He could not help but stutter, "Miss Sidney, you..." After saying this, the host of the Força Sanctuary regretted. Even Roderick was dead, what right did he have to ask such a question? There was no doubt that this she-devil was going to do something to him soon. But thinking of this, Jorf suddenly found courage, probably because of the mood of a broken pot. He suddenly raised his head and said loudly, "Lady Sydney, since you have betrayed the Holy Cathedral, then you are no longer a holy see of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Therefore we did not listen to your orders. The Forza Sanctuary will never bow to any infidels." With these words, the entire Forza temple actually fell deathly silent, so quiet that even the drop of a pin could be heard. Everyone in the surroundings looked at him like he was a madman, including the two masters of the academy. Their gazes were filled with both mixed feelings and admiration. "Your courage is commendable." But Sydney did not seem to be angry. She only said calmly, "But I am not the one who gave you the order. There is not much time left for Fathom Port. I hope you will not waste it." After saying this, she spread out her hands, and a shadow slowly rose from behind the statue of the Lion Palace Saintess. When they saw the shadow, everyone in the Forza Sanctuary was shocked. This is the Holy Sword Odorfice. The late king." Sydney's face was stern as she said coldly, "In the name of the Flame King Gretel, I declare that the Silver Queen is conspiring to divide the Holy Cathedral. All believers in the Forza Sanctuary and the parish of Fathom Port immediately submit to the spirit of the Holy Sword. Listen to my orders and start the Holy War." The two masters' faces were pale. Chapter 1039. The flaming blade, Odorfice, was hanging high above the main hall of the Fasa Holy Temple. The believers and Yalfo could even see a shadow behind the sword. The shadow was holding the sword in its hand and had a long dragon flame cloak draped over its body. Its back was facing the crowd. A strong emotion suddenly surged into Yalford's heart. It was as if he had seen the magnificent era of the past, but the sages and heroes were leaving them and drifting further and further away. The beliefs and pursuits of his youth, the worship of heroes and his unwavering faith in the Holy Cathedral of Fire were all recalled. It was as if a voice flowed in his heart, and after decades of fermenting and treasuring, it was bitter and regrettable. Yalf's legs went soft and he directly knelt down. As soon as he knelt, the low-level monks behind him also knelt down one by one. The two masters also knelt down in front of one of the four sages, King Gretel of the Cruise people. They were drenched in cold sweat and they couldn't say a word. "We once made a sacred covenant." "What is our covenant?" "Thousands of years ago, we defeated the Dark Dragon and liberated Won from tyranny. We are not saviors but we only pursued freedom. However, thousands of years later, the Myrna Empire no longer exists in this world. Do we still have the right to say that we are glorious people?" The shadow of the Flame King Gretel didn't say a word. However, to the loyal believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this question was in their hearts. Only those who had truly abandoned their faith could remain indifferent. Far away in the holy palace of Fanzan, a tall and imposing figure let out a long sigh. Her green eyes seemed to be able to see through the endless time, and under the intertwining lightning in the sky, everything that happened in the past, present, and future at the same time. The rise of the Myrna people and their fall, the destruction of the covenant between humans and elves, and the war between each other. It was like a cycle of 1,000 years, but this time, the liberators had become the oppressors. In the elven court, Saint Tassel the Wind Empress also felt something. She stood up on a rock in the forest, and the two hunter sisters and many night spirits looked up at her. She frowned slightly and looked towards the direction of the wind in the west. "Gretel, no matter if it was 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years later, you are still so upright. Everyone has changed but you have always been the same." In the Forza Basilica, everyone was kneeling. Sydney looked down at these people from the altar. These people were atoning for their sins. They didn't do anything wrong, they just forgot their vows. She turned back and said to the Roman, "Lady Roman, you did a good job. You didn't let them spread the news or else it would be a little troublesome. Now, please help me open the main gate. I need you to immediately announce this news to everyone." If we don, we. Undead army? Yalford, who was kneeling not far away, heard this word. He was stunned and raised his head. There were two obvious streaks of tears on his face, but this priest didn't have time to feel embarrassed. He hurriedly asked Sydney, "Lady Sydney, what did you say about the undead army? Why is there an undead army near Fat-Tan Port?" "You should know the history of the East Mets." Sydney looked at him and said coldly, "This undead army has been gathering since before the solar eclipse. They should have reached the east of the Golden Needle Valley, not too far away from Fat-Tan Port. If you don't want to see Fat-Tan Port become a living hell, you should act quickly and gather all the believers in the parish." Yalford's face changed drastically. he said, "How can this be? I understand, Miss Sydney. Please leave this task to me. This young lady is very unfamiliar in the parish. I can do it better if you leave this task to me." Kalmian too. Alamov stood out from the crowd. He first looked at the Roman, and when he saw that the latter had no intention of scolding him, he said loudly, "I'm the priest of the 3rd Street. My name is Alamov Shedal. Lady Sydney." Sydney looked at them and nodded. The two immediately turned and left to arrange the relevant matters. The statue of the Sacred Lady of the Leo Palace retracted her gaze and looked at the two masters kneeling on the ground. Yalford and the others could say that they didn't know the whole plan, but these two masters definitely knew the cause and effect of everything that happened today, including the Silver Queen's collusion with the undead. However, her gaze only lingered on the two trembling men for a moment before she coldly looked away. To be honest, if it wasn't for the situation, she had no interest in these internal struggles of the holy sanctum. "Lady Sydney?" At this time the Roman finally had time to interject. She had been curious for a long time. "Is this the flaming blade Odorfice?" She stared at the flaming blade Odorfice and asked. "This is the flaming blade Odorfice. But I heard that it was damaged. Have you fixed it?" "Fixed?" Sydney shook her head. How could she fix the flaming blade Odorfice? The sword spirit of the holy sword recognized Brando and merged with the latter. Only when the latter truly recognized the sword and the philosophy of the flaming King Gretel could it be possible to repair the sword. As for now, the sword was only in a temporary state of activation. She couldn't help but think of what happened a few hours ago. "Lady Sydney, since we are already allies and I'm about to go to war with Her Majesty as an ally, I won't be polite. There are some things that I may need you to do immediately." In the Imperial Army's camp, Brendel turned the hilt of his sword and knocked out the Kurlutz officer, then turned back and said to her. Sydney nodded and said, "Please speak." "You should also know that the Silver Queen is in cahoots with Madara. Currently, there is an army of the undead moving towards Fathom Harbor. I need you to help me destroy this army of the undead. You want me to go to Fathom Harbor and gather the mid-level and low-level priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to form a group of priests to fight against the undead." Brando nodded and said, "The holy spells of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and Fanzan are the nemesis of the undead. Although there are many undead this time, most of them are low-level undead. I think that as long as the mid-level and low-level priests of the Fathom Harbor Parish work together and are not defeated individually, it will be easy to deal with them." Sydney thought for a moment and said, "Even so, if the scale of the undead army is too large, we will only have a chance to win when the power of the Golden Flame is at its most abundant. But the undead will not fight us in broad daylight." "That is not necessarily true." Brando took out a gemstone shaped like an agate and waved it in front of her. "They will definitely attack Fathom Harbor during the day. I promise you that." Sydney frowned and nodded silently. "There is a second thing, Miss Sydney," Brando said again. "What is it?" "This matter is about you. Does Her Majesty know that you took away the fragment of the holy sword Odorfice?" Brando asked. "That's why she wants me to stay," Sydney replied calmly as if he was talking about something that had nothing to do with him. "I know what you want to say. You want to ask if she will send someone to stop me at Fatan Port?" "Yes, because the Holy Cathedral of Fire still has the secret of the Door of Flame, right?" Brando nodded. "I think she will send someone. Who do you think it will be? In the Holy Cathedral of Fire, there are no more than 10 people who can suppress you, right? Among them, the Great Holy See of Vala must be excluded. Caesar is on your side, so he should also be excluded. Among the remaining people, if the Flame Family Knight Regiment does not take action, then there should only be 2 or 3 people who can be chosen." Brando immediately analyzed. Sydney looked at him with some surprise. "I didn't expect you to know so much about us. It seems that Her Majesty has underestimated you." "Miss Sydney, you and I are not people who like to talk nonsense," Brando interrupted her and said, "Who do you think will come?" Roderick Barbarossa," Sydney replied with certainty. Brando was slightly stunned. The candidate in his heart was actually Roderick, and the other candidate was the Holy One Maddie, but he was not as sure as Sydney. He could not help but look at the statue of the Sacred Lady of the Leo Palace with some curiosity. The latter seemed to have seen through his thoughts and explained, "The most loyal person to Her Majesty is Roderick. This is a matter of great importance, so she will definitely let Roderick take action. Besides, Roderick is good at hymns, and this type of holy spell is very effective against me." Brando nodded. Sydney inherited the blood of angels and was good at close combat, and hymns with more control abilities were indeed very effective against her. How do you plan to deal with him? He asked again. Actually, as long as His Majesty notifies his men now and orders them to closely monitor the Fosha Holy Cathedral and not give them a chance to open the door of flame, it will be fine. Sydney replied, if I'm not wrong, Grey Sword St. Mephistopheles should also be in Fathom Port. Brando shook his head. No, Miss Sydney, my teacher is no longer in Fathom Port, and this choice is not good enough. If you believe me, I suggest you let Roderick come to Fathom Port and kill him. I can provide you with evidence to prove that he is colluding with All for One. Brando remembered that in history Roderick was found to be colluding with All for One after the Calamity of Wolves. Although he was not a member of All for One, he used his cooperation with All for One to eliminate dissidents in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He believed that this cooperation definitely did not start after the Calamity of Wolves, and some clues should be found in this era. But Sydney interrupted him, there's no need for that. You want to kill Roderick? Brando was slightly stunned and looked at her with some surprise. So you already knew? To this question, Sydney did not choose to answer but only said lightly, it's not difficult for me to deal with Roderick, but it's impossible to kill him. Besides, he definitely won't come alone. The lowest level of the Door of Flame in the Holy Cathedral of Fire can teleport two people who are about the same strength as Roderick. He might have brought two high-ranking priests with him. It's not that easy to kill him, but it's not impossible, right? Brando heard the hidden meaning in her words. Sydney nodded, I need your help. I need you to give me a part of the soul of the Holy Sword. The soul of the Holy Sword? Brando reacted, you want to restore Odorfice. Not really, Sydney shook her head, but as long as I have a part of the soul of the Holy Sword, I can temporarily activate it. The Holy Sword Odorfice and the Flame King Gretel are the source of the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. They are supreme beings. With their blessing, no holy spell of the Holy Cathedral of Fire can defeat me. Brando was silent for a moment, then whispered, I have never felt the existence of the soul of Odorfice. Can I do it? You can do it. Then I understand. With a creak, the main door of the Holy Cathedral of Fossa was pushed open from the outside, and only then did Sydney recover from her thoughts. Then she heard the crisp voice of the Roman, Marjorie, you're here too? Miss Roman, why are you here? What's going on? The one who strode in from the main door was Sergeant Marjorie. It was Sydney's first time seeing this young man, but she immediately saw Yalfo and Alamov outside the main door. Many believers were gathered behind them, and it seemed that the two of them were quite efficient. They had already informed her of what she had asked them to do. Marjorie, this is Lady Sydney, the Roman thought for a moment, probably thinking about how to introduce the statue of the Sacred Lady of the Leo Palace. She's very powerful. But Marjorie had already learned from the Shire and Brando that this priestess of the Holy Cathedral was from the upper echelons of the Holy Cathedral. In fact, he knew more about this priestess than Romain. He nodded to her and looked around. When he saw that the situation in the Holy Cathedral was not out of control, he sighed in relief. Lady Sydney, did you gather these believers? Although the situation was a little different from what he had imagined, Sydney did not deny it. She only nodded and said, Yes, I believe you already understand the situation at hand. I want to take these believers away immediately. Is that okay? Marjorie shook his head. No problem, the Lord has already given us the order. But do you need any help, lady? No, Sydney replied. You just need to do your own thing. Guard the gate well and don't let any undead in. I understand. The Roman looked at the two of them with some boredom. She turned her eyes to the side and was pleasantly surprised to see the animated gate of the Holy Cathedral of Fosha giving Erwin a hard time. Hey young man, have you figured out the answer to this question? You don't look that stupid. Is your brain filled with moldy flour? No, Haruz frowned and pouted. Mr. Daimon, it's because your question is too difficult. How can I guess what you're thinking? Well, let's change the question. Then please ask, Mr. Gate, can you guess my name? Chapter 1040. A gust of cold wind blew into the room, and Count Brill saw that the light of the candle had suddenly dimmed. What's wrong? He turned around and looked at his old friend Ambunal, who was holding a bone staff and was in a gloomy state that made him uneasy. Oh. The Duke slowly opened his eyes, and there was a hint of dark red in his blue-gray eyes. He lowered his head and silently looked at the bone staff in his hand. Then, he gently let go of his hand, and the bone staff floated in the air as if it was held up by an invisible force. Count Brill frowned as he looked at this scene. He did not like this thing. No owner of this dark treasure in history had a good ending. He also did not like the undead of Madara. This battle would bring considerable trouble to his territory. Although the Silver Queen would compensate him accordingly, he was more worried about his old friend. He felt that his old friend had become much gloomier these days. But the Count understood that his old friend was a soldier, and he was just the Lord of Ovchin. There were some things that he could not interfere with. Duke Embunal suddenly stood up from his chair and turned to the stone window. He left the staff, which was shrouded in black smoke, floating up and down. Outside the stone window was half of a Vezin port, which was now completely frozen. He looked beyond the city wall and saw the winding Silver Valley coast in the dark. "What's wrong, old friend?" The Count felt that the temperature in the room seemed to have dropped by a few degrees, and he could not help but ask. He saw that even the fire in the fireplace had dimmed, and the burning flames had turned into small flames. "There's a small problem," Duke Embunal replied gloomily. "I suddenly feel that I can't sense one of the bone staff." Outside Ovchin City, the undead army was standing still. Under Brando's command, Krot broke the bone staff in her hand. A black light shot out from the broken bone staff and went straight into Brando's chest. Brando knew that there were a lot of things in his body, and this black light seemed to be related to the black pearl described by Haku, so he did not show any signs of fuss. He just checked his condition and found that there was nothing wrong with him. In addition to the power of the blood of the Dark God or the Black Pearl, there should be the soul of the Holy Sword Odorfice in his body. According to Sydney, it was the power of the Flame Pearl. However, these two powers existed in his body at the same time without any sign of conflict. In fact, between these two powers, Brando could not feel the existence of the blood of the Dark God at all except for its influence on the elemental pool. It was the same for the soul of Odorfice. He only felt its existence when he transferred the latter into the fragment of the flaming blade. Normally he could not detect it at all, and it did not even affect his fire elemental pool. As for why one could affect the elemental pool and the other could not, Brando vaguely felt that the difference between the two was that one had self-awareness, while the other did not. Odorfice was the sword soul of the flaming blade. In the Amber Sword, the so-called sword soul was actually the alignment of the Holy Sword due to the influence of its master and experience. Although it could not be compared to true wisdom, at least it had the ability to judge. The Black Pearl, on the other hand, had been in a state of being divided into two for a long time, and the part controlled by the Black Pearl was obviously smaller. As for the blood of the Dark God, another way of saying the power of the Black Pearl, that was injected into his body at the beginning, it was even thinner, and there was no possibility of it having self-awareness and self-judgment. The power of the Black Pearl and the Flame Pearl was obviously very unique, and they were different from any power Brando knew of. In Wand, most of the power and energy was shown on the outside, and it would actually increase your energy level, which was the energy level, OZ. It would change your external or internal strength, such as the 3 pillars of the body, strength, dexterity, physique, or the 3 pillars of the soul, perception, will, and bloodline. Although the elemental orbs had shown powerful miraculous powers in history, such as the terrifying lethality of the flaming blade and the frost chant, you could not feel their energy level. They were like magical items without any energy, which sounded like a paradox in itself because in the world of Wand, the definition of a magical item was an item that contained some kind of power or energy. Not only the elemental orbs themselves, but even the power they contained seemed to have the same nature. After the bone staff was destroyed, Yuta and the others who were standing at the back immediately noticed the changes that happened to the skeleton soldiers around them. The thousands of undead that were still on the snow-covered shore of the Silver Valley suddenly rippled out, and in an instant, the undead army melted like snow. At the same time, Brando, who was silently looking at Ovachin's direction, felt something and narrowed his eyes. He gestured to Teru, and the young wizard immediately cast a spell. A water-like ripple spread out in the surrounding space, shielding the aura of the living. A little further away, some undead that smelled the aura of the living in the wind staggered and stopped. The undead army was collapsing and scattering in 2s and 3s, like lonely ghosts wandering in the wilderness. "My lord, I don't understand. Why did you destroy the bone staff? Isn't it better to order the undead to attack the harbor? Although they are weak, they can at least be used as cannon fodder, right?" Teru looked at the scene in front of him in confusion. Brando smiled and shook his head. The thousands of skeletons that had not been strengthened by the undead's secret magic were useless. He did not need such a weak attack. He only sneaked in to confirm one thing, and now he got the answer. Ovchin Port was not a military fortress like Fatine Port. As an important commercial port in the northern Sublime Inland Sea, after hundreds of years of development, the size of the port was no longer what it used to be. As the city area expanded, the merchants in the port had long torn down the outer walls. In the hinterland of the empire, the area with the most stable order and the White Legion's garrison, Ovchin did not need these defensive facilities. For the sake of tax revenue, the city's ruler, the Brill family, chose to acquiesce to this behavior. As the city expanded, Ovchin gradually crossed its original border, the Turquoise River, and formed two districts on the east and west of the river. The eastern district was the Old District, and Ovchin's earliest city gate and wharf were on the east bank of the Turquoise River. The western district was the New District, and there were neatly organized workshops and handicraft workshops, as well as two markets. It was worth mentioning that Ovchin's newly built Fort Conway was also located in the northern district. This fort stood on the north bank of the Turquoise River, and it was like a silent, dark ghost in the midst of the lights on the north bank. At this moment, Brendel felt a strong calling coming from the fortress. There was no doubt that the treasure of darkness that White spoke of was located in this fortress. It indeed had some sort of control over all the fakes that were created using its power. If that was the case, then Duke Embuner, who was in possession of it, should not be too far away. He easily suppressed the impulse in his heart. For him who had more than 2/3 of the power of the Orb of Darkness, the so-called Treasure of Darkness in Duke Embuner's hands was not even worth mentioning. Embuner should have already discovered his existence. But it was too late. Brando took out a gem-like object from his bosom. This gemstone was dull and crescent-shaped, like some kind of feldspar or obsidian. He only took a glance at it and threw it forward. The gemstone drew a flat arc and landed on the beach. However, there was no sand on the beach at the moment, only thick layers of snow. The gemstone sank deep into the snow. Above his head, the sky was dark and the 12 moons were dim. In just a few hours, the outer sea of the sublime inland sea seemed to have completely changed. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled on the surface of the sea, and the intertwining lightning reflected a ferocious scene. The entire sea seemed to be boiling, and in an instant huge waves of hundreds of feet in the shape of mountains rolled up and surged down. One after another, it was like moving mountains or giant beasts were slaughtering each other. Far in the horizon, glaciers froze the coast, and the ice field extended all the way to the depths of the sea. Huge icebergs floated on the raging sea, cracking, freezing, and then disappearing into the depths of the darkness. The entire sky and earth were shrouded in a curtain of rain. The line of rain that fell from the sky blurred the line between the sea and the sky, blurring the entire world together, forming an impenetrable world of water. However, a silver fleet was sailing through the curtain of rain. On the breaker, the wizard on duty, Telman, was somewhat uneasy about what was happening on the surface of the sea. Mortals often thought that wizards were omnipotent, and that nothing could surprise or frighten them. However, this was often not the case. Telman was 21 years old this year. Before becoming a wizard, he was actually the son of a farmer in Tanajul. He was fortunate enough to learn a few words from a wandering wizard, and because of that, he was chosen by the first batch of students in the Shire Wizard Tower and became the third batch of students in the Shire Wizard Tower. He was very smart and learned very quickly. A month ago he became an apprentice wizard. Later he was chosen by the Buga to become one of the official wizards on the newly built escort cruiser, the Breaker. Although he had the title of an official wizard, in reality, Telman was still a half-baked apprentice wizard. He had not learned much and was far from the real apprentices. The wizards in the Wizard Tower usually trained an apprentice for 5 years. Although the apprenticeship of the Buga wizards was short, it usually took them 10 years or more before they were officially exposed to magic. In other words, they were exposed to the basics of magic from birth. Therefore, although Telman had a preliminary understanding of the world of magic, he was still far from being exposed to the real world. What was the world? It was a difficult question for many wizards who had seen a lot of things, let alone for Telman, who was still a novice wizard who was still a farmer's son. He looked at the scene in front of him with some fear, as if he saw the end of the world. In fact, he was not the only one who thought this at the moment. On the entire ship and even the entire fleet there were many people who had the same thought. What was happening in front of them was beyond their understanding of the civil war of the Empire, or even the scope of the Holy War. At this moment, many people had a vague idea in their hearts. Perhaps this time the 4 holy cathedrals were really in trouble. They did not know that this speculation was accurate, and the consequences were far beyond their imagination. Before the fleet was formed, the temporary military management and training that the Bugas had requested finally worked. That was why Telman did not have the mentality of running away at the last minute. At least he remembered what he was currently shouldering, and what the responsibility of being the vanguard of the fleet was. Suddenly, the crystal ball in front of Telman lit up and flickered slightly. When he saw the words on the crystal ball, he was so shocked that he jumped out of his chair and even stepped on one of his boots. But he did not have the heart to pick it up. Instead, he immediately rushed out of the room barefooted. Behind the young wizard, a small line of numbers on the crystal ball was shining. X, 3321, Y, 4211, Z, 0311, swoosh, 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 swoosh. A series of low and uniform footsteps echoed on the snow in the dark. The rustling sound lasted for a long time before it finally stopped. Outside Fat Tan Port was a cliff mountain road that was easy to defend and difficult to attack. At the end of the mountain road there was an inward valley. In clear weather, looking into the valley from the walls of the fortress outside the port, one could often see for miles. But at this moment only darkness could be seen. But if one looked carefully, one could see faint flashes of light in the darkness. In Erewhon, the veterans of Buchi and Karsuk only needed one glance to be shocked and recognize that it was the unique light of the soul fire of the undead army when they were marching. But at this moment, the troops stationed in the fortress were only port guards who took orders from Baron Ludwig. These soldiers had not even seen bandits before, let alone the undead. Death seemed to be closing in on him silently. Sok stared coldly at the progress of the undead army in the snow. With the help of the dim light, he could see a large group of undead approaching the fortress wall on the cliff. The liches had already arranged 2 rows of skeleton archers in front, but there was still no response from Fathom Harbor. Those fellows must have thought that it was impossible for them to be attacked in such a bad weather. Moreover, this solar eclipse was originally accidental to them. At the thought of the solar eclipse, a hint of gloom suddenly rose in Sok's heart. If even a solar eclipse could be artificially created, his future days might not be as stable as he imagined. Furthermore, the current weather did not seem as simple as a solar eclipse. When he thought about the various signs that had happened in the Empire recently, it seemed that none of them were good omens. Troubled times were coming. Such a thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Chapter 1041. At the first moment, the fortress on the sea cliff path outside Fathom Port was declared lost. The guards on the city wall were caught off guard and were nailed to death by the nether steel arrows shot out from the darkness. Their blood froze before it could flow out. Under the command of the necromancer, the skeletons used siege weapons to break open the door. The soldiers in the barracks realized that they were in trouble, but they were already surrounded. The resistance in the fortress only lasted for a moment before it died down. More than 30 coast guards in the barracks were all killed. Fat Tan Port was built as a fortress for the fleet. It was located between the cliffs of the sea, and there were only 2 narrow mountain paths connecting the port to the outside world. The Imperial Navy had built the fortress on these 2 mountain paths. The front of the fortress faced the valley that led to the sea cliff. One side of the fortress was close to the precipice, and the other side was close to the sea. Could be said that one man could hold back 10,000 men. 500 meters behind the fortress was the main wall of Fat Tan Port. Between these 500 meters was still the mountain path and the beach, but the terrain was much smoother and flatter than the previous section. At this moment, Baron Ludwig and Delphian were on the main wall 500 meters behind the fortress. The wall was already filled with the White Lion Guards and Coast Guards, but under the orders of the Prime Minister's daughter, they extinguished all the torches and held their breath, not making a sound. It was dark on the wall. A few wizards cast a magic barrier to hide the breath of the living. Magic covered the entire section of the wall. The Baron looked at the sounds of resistance in the fortress a few hundred meters away. Then the fortress returned to darkness. He was very annoyed. He turned to Delphian and said, "Since you knew about the attack of the undead, why didn't you let them prepare in advance and give up the fortress? I know you have old grudges with the Erewhon, but you can't drag us down with you." His words were very unpleasant, but even 10 times worse could not make Delphian frown. She could not stand the stupid noise. She replied coldly, "As the military commander of this fortress, please show some basic military literacy. Don't make a fool of yourself in front of others. I didn't want to remind you, but I was afraid that you would embarrass the Empire in front of the guests." "What did you say?" Just as Baron Ludwig was about to lose his temper, Count Alcons hurriedly pulled him aside. He knew that although Ludwig was the owner of Fathom Harbor, in fact, it was the fleet commander stationed in the harbor who was responsible for maintaining the operation of the harbor and managing the fleet. Baron Ludwig actually did not have high military literacy. He was just a local feudal lord. However, he had already seen through the intentions of the Prime Minister's daughter. She wanted to let the undead in so that the priest could have a chance to launch a fatal blow. Once they entered the narrow and rugged sea cliff mountain path that was more than 500 meters away from the main city wall of Fatan Port, they would not be able to leave easily. This was the only way to ensure that their trump card would be able to bring out the greatest effect. However, the main city wall of Fatan Port was not tall. It was only a little more than 8 meters tall. In the fantasy world it was not enough. This was because the sea cliff fortress outside the harbor was too sturdy. The original architect had considered the load bearing of the sandbar in the harbor, so he did not continue to increase the height of the wall. Now Count Alcons was very regretful. He secretly blamed the original architect for cutting corners. No matter what, for an imperial fortress, they should have poured magic into the ground to reinforce the sandbar so that they could build a fortress wall that was more than 13 meters tall. At the very least, they should have built a fortress wall that was 10 meters tall. Then they would not have to be so worried now. Moreover, although most of the distance from the main city wall of Fatan to the Sea Cliff Fortress was narrow Sea Cliff Mountain path, near the main city wall, especially under the city gate, there was an open sandbar terrain, which was very conducive for the undead to deploy their forces. There were not many troops left in Fatan Port. Among them there were more than 1,000 coast guards left, and the personal guards of Erwin's envoy group were about a few hundred people. If their trump card did not work, these few people could rely on the low main city wall and the unfavorable terrain to defend the port. Perhaps before the trump card could be moved to its position, the defense line would be in danger. However, he did not dare to express his worries. He only explained it to Baron Ludwig. After listening to the explanation, the latter calmed down and stopped talking. However, Eneide, who was next to Eugenie, seemed to be a little reluctant. She questioned, "Even if that's the case, you should tell the people in front to retreat. That's more than 40 lives. How can you let them die in vain?" Delphine glanced at her coldly. Soft-hearted. Delphine thought for a moment and understood that she was still on the side of Erwin's people. She sighed and explained, "Even if I send someone to inform them, I'll give them the order to defend until the end. However, I know that they will definitely not do that. If they escape back, they will die under the sword of the military judge. It's better to let them be heroes without knowing it. At least, this result will be better for their families." Eneide's eyes widened. She looked back in disbelief and asked, "Is that so, Chiara?" The little girl nodded helplessly. "Something like that." However, she immediately stared at Delphine and asked, "But more importantly, you want them to die more realistically, right?" "Something like that," Delphine also answered non-committally. "They're soldiers. I have the right to choose how they will die. As long as we can achieve victory, there are only stupid and wise orders in war. There is no difference between cruel and kind orders." It was snowing and the snow fell on the faces of the girls present. Eneide and Eugenie frowned. The elf and her pseudo-dragon leaned on the wall to look at the situation outside. However, because she was too short, she could only stick her head out of the battlements even if she tried her best to tiptoe. Chiara looked indifferent. Delphine's face was calm and indifferent. Raindrops slid down her smooth and beautiful face and slid down her ugly and uneven scars. Count Alcorn, on the other hand, agreed with this sentence even more. He thought that she was indeed the woman who was known as the flower of the empire. After all, she lived up to her reputation. At this time, there was a slight noise in the darkness far away. Everyone present knew that the undead had opened the gate on the other side of the fortress and were ready to attack Fathom Harbor. Delphine stopped arguing and turned around to give an order to the officer of the Coast Guard. "Knight Captain Charot." "Yes, sir." "I order you to lead your men out of the city immediately and attack the undead. Launch an attack on Fort Seacliff. You must take back the southern wall of the fortress." "What?" Baron Ludwig jumped up in shock and growled from his throat. "Vicious woman, you can't give orders like this. How dare you let my men go out of the city and attack the undead that outnumber them by hundreds and thousands? You are crazy. We only have so few men. Do you really want to give up Fathom Harbor?" Alcorn frowned and tried to persuade her. "Miss Delphine, our forces are seriously insufficient. If we were at Fort Seacliff it would be fine. But here, if we go out of the city, we will have to attack from above. It is extremely disadvantageous for us both in terms of military strength and terrain." Delphine was not affected at all. She replied coldly, "Am I the commander or are you the commander? Let me remind you that my authority as the commander was given by both the eldest prince and Count Trentheim. I have the highest authority here, and you must obey my orders unconditionally. What, do you want to defy military orders or do you want to defect at the last minute?" "You." Baron Ludwig's face turned green. "Do you mean that if you want us to die, we must obey unconditionally? First of all, I want to correct your mistake. I can't let my soldiers die for nothing. Secondly, you are right. Even if I want you to die, you must obey unconditionally. Delphian sat in her wheelchair in the rain and answered word by word, of course you can object. I welcome you to ask the eldest son of the emperor for his opinion and remove me from the position of commander. It will only take a quarter of an hour to get to the eldest son of the emperor. I estimate that the battle will start around this time. You don't have much time left. Baron Ludwig's lips trembled in anger. Marjorie frowned and stepped forward. Miss Delphian, let us go first. The White Lion Guards are ready. Unexpectedly, the Prime Minister's daughter glanced at him coldly. Shut up. Did I ask you to express your opinion? Get out of here. Knight Marjorie, I don't think you need me to tell you what a soldier should do. My orders are not to be disobeyed. A bolt of lightning pierced down from the dark clouds, causing everyone's faces to turn pale. Some were shocked, some were angry, and some were interested. Only Delphine's expression did not change from beginning to end. She looked at Charlotte and asked, Knight Commander, is it your honor as a knight that is causing you to hesitate? Charlotte's expression changed. He glanced at the direction of the pitch-black fortress Seacliff and finally nodded. I understand, Madam Commander. The process of taking down Fort Seacliff was smooth beyond imagination. The plan seemed to have achieved the desired effect. The residents of Fathom Harbor and the Erewhon people stationed there were not prepared at all. They must have been flustered by the sudden solar eclipse and did not realize that the Empire would launch an attack at this moment. Sock was walking along a flight of stairs to the southern section of Fort Seacliff's wall. He then raised his head and looked at Fathom Harbor. The harbor was filled with lights. It seemed that many people had gathered on the streets because of the sudden solar eclipse. He was a subordinate of the White Legion's Raven Cavalry, a subordinate of the great knight Hayden. Hayden the Bull had always been the vanguard of the Legion, and this time was no exception. Sock and a few other knight commanders were mainly responsible for coordinating and observing the attack of the undead at the front line. According to expectations, the undead would form the first wave of the sneak attack because their abilities would be greatly enhanced during the solar eclipse, while the human legion would be severely weakened. With such an advantage, the undead would break through the outer walls of Fort Seacliff and Fathom Harbor and enter the street battle. It did not matter even if the battle turned into a meat grinder since they could afford it anyway. The main enemy of the White Legion was the fleet of the Bugas that was anchored in Fathom Harbor. From the beginning to the end, Duke Ambunal believed that the fleet anchored in Fathom Harbor was controlled by the Bugas. As for the Erewhon people, it was just a pretense. How could the Erewhon people have such a powerful fleet? Judging from the current situation, Sock observed that the situation at the front line was very good. He saw the skeletons opening the south gate of Fort Seacliff under the command of the Lich and releasing a small group of skeletons to test the waters. These skeletons were glowing white under the reflection of the lights in the distance. They were arranged in a tight formation, and the Stygian steel swords in their hands did not glow at all. They were the perfect weapons for a night attack. The skeletons went down the mountain path, and further away the main city wall of Fathom Harbor was pitch black. There was not even the slightest light and there was no movement. The Lich in front of him sent back a message that there were only a few living beings on the city wall. This was also in line with his expectations. It seemed that this was indeed an undefended harbor, at least for now. But for some reason Sock felt a little uneasy. He had told a few of his colleagues about this uneasiness, but he was ridiculed for being too cautious. In the words of the cavalry under Bull Hayden, being cautious actually meant being timid. Naturally, he could not accept this evaluation. Now, he came to the southern section of the wall of Fort Seacliff to verify his thoughts. But at least for now, it seemed that he was indeed too suspicious. Sock mocked himself in his heart. Perhaps it was because this battle was too easy, so easy that it was unbelievable. However, the 20 to 30 coast guards who were killed by the undead did not seem to know about this. It seemed that there was no trap in this. He stood on the city wall and took one last look at the direction of Fathom Harbor. He planned to walk down the city wall. It was too cold outside and his colleagues did not want to stay in this terrible weather. They had already found a warm place to hide in the barracks. At this time, Captain Knight Charut from Fathom Harbor led a small team of his men to a place not far away from the southern section of the wall of Fort Seacliff. According to Delphian's order, they brought along a wizard. This wizard was from Tonagel and was not very familiar with the others. He just silently maintained a breath of the dead spell in the team. Charut, who was walking at the front, made a gesture and the whole team stopped. Not far ahead was a small team of undead that was leaving the fort. Under the cold light, they looked like a forest of skeletons. There were more than 100 skeletons. It could not be helped. To the undead this was a small team of skeletons. Sharut frowned. The Coast Guards were not the frontline army of the Kurluts. He and his men could barely reach the silver level, but it was still a headache to face more than 100 skeletons, not to mention how many more were behind the fortress. He looked up and saw a sudden shadow on the southern section of the fortress wall not far away. He hurriedly turned back to his subordinates and whispered, "Take care of them. That's a lich. These low-level skeletons are actually under the command of a lich. As long as we kill the lich commanding them, they won't be a threat anymore. David, take out the holy water you received and pour it on the arrows. We'll kill that guy with one arrow. As long as we kill it, I'll give you a reward." Chapter 1042. The first wave of battle broke out very quickly, but Sharut's attack was severely hindered. After shooting an arrow at the southern section of the seaside cliff fortress, they were soon exposed. They were besieged and had no choice but to retreat. At one point, the battle line retreated to the middle point between the main wall of Fathom Harbor and the seaside cliff fortress. Delphian had to send in 2 more coast guards to join the battle before they could stabilize the situation. On the southern section of the wall of the seaside cliff fortress, the knight Captain Sock, who had just had a false alarm, also noticed that the attack of the undead was hindered. It seems that the previous attack was discovered. He immediately realized this. The intention of these coast guards was obviously to take back the seaside cliff fortress, but they obviously did not realize that there were so many enemies in the seaside cliff fortress. Now the enemy was still stubbornly resisting. It seemed that they were trying to buy time for their allies to set up their defenses. Since when did the coast guards of Fathom Harbor have such a high fighting spirit and tactical literacy? He could not help but feel a little surprised. This did not mean that he knew much about these local garrison troops, which were not even considered as a second-rate army. It was just a general understanding. As the elite of the Empire and the vanguard of the White Legion, Sock certainly had the right to look down on these local brothers. Today, the performance of the Coast Guards was clearly a little beyond his expectations. After investing 2 squads of fresh troops into the battle, the situation on the battlefield suddenly tilted. Sharut and his comrades managed to push their way back to the bottom of the southern wall of the fortress. They even climbed up the rocks and launched 2 assaults on the wall. Unfortunately, they were repelled by the liches and skeletons on the wall. This was not unusual. As the terrain outside the seaside cliff fortress was very narrow, only near the second half of the sandbar would it become open and flat again. However, Sharut and his colleagues firmly guarded the path of the seaside cliff fortress. The undead's superior military strength could not be used at all. Although the coast guards were not worth mentioning in front of the White Legion, when faced with the same number of weak skeletons, they had an absolute advantage. However, the liches quickly mobilized the skeleton archers from the rear and changed the situation of the battle once again. Rows of skeleton archers lined up in neat rows and shot down from the southern wall of Fort Seacliff. The dense nether steel arrow rain caused Sharut's team to suffer heavy losses. The other 2 teams suffered similar losses as well. The morale of the coast guards that had just been boosted immediately dropped to the freezing point. They retreated all the way to Fathom Port's main wall. Seeing this scene, Baron Ludwig on the wall could not help but feel a little embarrassed. Although he was not the military chief of Fathom Harbor, the coast guards were directly under the command of the mayor of Fathom Harbor. When he saw the coast guards fleeing from the battlefield, he could not help but want to overstep his authority and scold these guys. However, when the words were about to come out of his mouth, he remembered that he was the commander here. He could only swallow his curses with a gloomy face. Delphian was much calmer than him. It was as if she had already expected this. She quietly looked at the scene below the wall and ordered, "Fire the arrows." Her voice was not loud, but the herald faithfully passed down her order. The soldiers on the wall stepped back, and 2 rows of archers with longbows appeared at the back. Archers were rare in Wound. Most of them were professional soldiers or mercenaries. Crossbowmen were common in the general army, and there were more crossbowmen than archers. Archers would not be able to go to the battlefield without years of training. However, the Empire's harbor guards actually had a team of trained archers. Their strength was evident and it made people sigh in admiration. In fact, when Marjorie and Eugenie learned about the existence of such a team of longbowmen, their faces were a little strange. In Wound, almost all archers used magic bows. This was because the investment in training an archer was much more than the investment in making a magic bow. Archers who used magic bows were much more powerful than crossbowmen in terms of shooting range, accuracy, and density. They could also use enchanted arrows. When using enchanted arrows, the power of a longbow was much greater than that of a crossbow. The archers drew their longbows under the command. The arrows on the bows shone with a faint golden light. They were wet, and it was obvious that they had just been watered with holy water. Rows of longbows were raised in the rain, and the arrows were accurately aimed at a certain shooting angle. This was one of the reasons why magic bows were much more powerful than heavy crossbows. They were waterproof. Normal bows and crossbows would lose a lot of power due to moisture, but magic items did not have this concern. The herald looked at Delphian, who nodded coldly. Fire! 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 The command sounded. At that moment, the entire city wall lit up. It was as if a dark golden line was flashing at the same time. That was the cold light of an arrow leaving the bowstring. In the curtain of rain, there seemed to be a white line moving forward. With a sharp whoosh, it was as if a gust of wind was blowing in his face. A rain of arrows had already begun to fall on the sandbar. Normally, arrows were not very effective against skeletons. This was because the arrows could easily pass through the holes in their bones. Even if they were lucky enough to hit the bones, they would only break 1 or 2 ribs. Only if they were lucky enough to break the tibia or neck would they be able to cause effective damage. However, in the darkness of the night, the probability of that happening was too low. But this rain of arrows was different. When each arrow got close to a skeleton, it would emit a strong holy light. The skeletons that were hit were like melted butter. The arrows passed through their bodies, leaving a huge cavity. There were even golden flames burning where the broken bones were. Even in the rain and snow, the flames did not seem to be extinguished. Instead, they burned more and more fiercely, turning the skeletons into ashes. In the darkness of the battlefield, it was as if a golden sea of fire had risen. The sea of skeletons under the main city wall of Fatten Port was burned without any warning. Get ready for the second round of shooting, Delphian ordered. At the same time she shouted, Marjorie. Yes. Get ready to attack. I want you to lead 3 teams of White Lion Guards to drive the undead army back to the southern part of the fortress of Seacliff and attack the fortress. Yes. Marjorie replied without hesitation. At this time, the archers had completed the second round of shooting. On the battlefield, a trained crossbowman needed 12 seconds to reload, but a well-trained archer only needed 1/3 of that time. Another rain of golden arrows fell on the skeletons' heads. The few teams of skeletons under the city wall immediately became sparse. However, they did not collapse. The most troublesome thing about the undead army was that they had no morale, especially the low-level undead. Although they lacked intelligence, they did not feel fear. Naturally, they would not retreat easily. At this time, the city gate slowly rose. Marjorie led the White Lion Guards and charged out. Archers, changed to enchanted arrows. Get ready for the third round of shooting. I want you to cover the rear of the undead army and cover Marjorie's attack, Delphian calmly ordered. Miss Delphian, why do you want to change to arrows? Earl Alcorn was anxious. The attack effect of holy arrows is very good. There are still a few bullets left. Arrows have no effect on the skeletons. Delphian glanced at him and replied in an unfriendly tone, Am I the commander or are you the commander? Follow my orders. Light the torches. The moment the main city wall of Fat-Tan Port lit up, Sock knew that today's sneak attack had come to an end. He saw torches and braziers being lit one after another on the city wall 500 meters away. Under the light of the torches, the walkway on the city wall was full of soldiers. The archers of the Coast Guard stood neatly in 2 rows. When the archers shot the first 2 rounds of arrows, he frowned slightly and subconsciously looked around suspiciously. However, when the third round of arrows flashed in the rain, Sock finally felt relieved. It seemed that the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the city did not gather immediately. The plan was well executed. The holy arrows from before should be ammunition. According to the intelligence, the Coast Guard should not have too many bullets left in their enchanted arrows. As for the holy arrows, there were even fewer. After all, there had never been any record of an undead attack in this area before. However, the attack was inevitably repelled. Following the rain of arrows, he saw an unfamiliar army charging out of Fat-Tan Port. The combat power of this new force was not weaker than the Coast Guard's. In fact, it was much stronger. The equipment of the other party seemed to be between light and heavy infantry. However, their movements were very agile and their attacks were very explosive. A few skeleton squads could not withstand such an attack at all. They were quickly forced back to the Sea Cliff path. This was obviously not an ordinary army. The term White Lion Legion immediately came to mind. Duke Ambunal had made thorough arrangements before attacking Fat-Tan Port. Of course, intelligence work was indispensable. Therefore, Sok was very clear about the details of Erewhon's people stationed in Fatan Port. Of course, even Duke Ambunal would not be clear about the difference between the White Lion Legion and the White Lion Guards in that small kingdom. He just hastily mixed the two together. The sneak attack was discovered and the attack was blocked. The battle that originally had the upper hand had unsurprisingly turned into a head-on confrontation. However, this was not beyond Sok's expectations. In fact, being able to take down Fort Seacliff so easily was already beyond his expectations. It might even be beyond the expectations of the commander-in-chief of this battle, Duke Ambunal. The Coast Guards and Erewhon's people could not rely on the low main walls of Fatan Port to defend. What they had to do was to break through the city gate in one go and then throw the undead into the street battle. Of course, it would be best if there was no street battle. He hoped that once the city wall fell, the enemy who had lost all hope would disarm and surrender. However, judging from the intensity of the resistance at the moment, it seemed that this wish would come to nothing. Sok naturally attributed this to the fact that the eldest prince was in the city. However, he was not very worried because the undead were cannon fodder. Even if they were all killed here, no one would feel the slightest bit of heartache. Using the undead to deplete the blood of Erewhon's people and the Coast Guards in street battle was obviously a good deal. As for the White Legion, Sok was very clear that they only had one enemy. He suddenly turned his head. The valley behind him was dark, but he knew that tens of thousands of undead were clustered there. Further away there was the hilly area around the Golden Needle Valley. He did not know if Erewhon and the others were in position. He frowned silently. Ovchin Port, Fort Kongwei. With a creak, the door of the room was pushed open by an attendant. My lord, Sir Erewhon and his Griffin Brigade have arrived at the designated area. Sir Berend and his Silver-Winged Knight Regiment also sent a magic message 3 minutes ago, saying that they are ready. Duke Ambunal retracted his gaze from the stone window. What about the Buga fleet? There is no movement yet. How is the battle at Fatan Port? The observation at the front line shows that the sneak attack was very successful. The undead vanguard took down Fort Seacliff in one fell swoop. However, the enemy's resistance is very fierce. The battle line is in a deadlock under Fatan City. Duke Ambunal frowned slightly. Without Fort Seacliff, the Erewhon's people won't be able to hold on for long. I will let the Madara people work harder. You may leave. Inform Erewhon and Berend to be ready to attack at any time. Count Brill looked at the door that was closed again. He turned around and asked, Old friend? Don't worry, old friend. It's not a big problem. Duke Ambunal glanced at the bone staff that was floating in the air. I have already sent people to investigate. A few hours ago, we lost contact with Maroli and his men in the Golden Needle Forest. A fake bone staff also went missing together with them. I think the rats must have sneaked in. It's fine? The former frowned slightly and asked uneasily. The situation at the front line is fine. The situation at the front line is great. The Bugas would never dream of our plan. We can't blame them. I'm afraid no one in this world would think that Her Majesty has formed an alliance with Madara. Duke Ambunal was in a good mood. Madara's attack is more successful than expected. Without Fort Seacliff, the Erewhon's people in the port will not be able to save their lives. That poor count, he is being used by the Bugas without knowing it. But the Empire will not pity him. He walked to the side of the count's desk and picked up the flint and iron on the desk to light his pipe. He then took a puff from the pipe, squinted his eyes and sighed deeply. The rats that sneaked into Ovchin must be the scouts of the northern barbarians. Don't worry, someone will take care of them. This is not like you, old friend. You boast before the war is over. Count Brill seemed to be affected by the mood and laughed. Where is our cautious White Duke? This war has already ended, Brill. Duke Ambunal shook his head. The Bugas can't declare war on two empires at the same time. That being said, Count Brill reminded, don't forget that the Bugas have a fleet here. Yes, Duke Ambunal replied without hesitation. So we are waiting for their fleet. Chapter 1043. When the undead sneak attack turned into a frontal attack, the situation on the battlefield of Fatan Port quickly changed. The Liches used their air force for the first time. There were countless sounds of wings flapping in the darkness. The Kurlut soldiers on the city wall were still puzzled. What was that sound? But the young men of the White Lion Guards beside them had a drastic change in expression. Get down? They pulled their colleagues from the Empire to the ground and then shrunk behind the battlements. The Coast Guards were dizzy from the fall. Before they could curse, a terrible rain of bones fell from the sky. Countless skeletal vultures fell from the sky and crashed onto the city wall. The soldiers who were hit by them had broken bones or died on the spot. A cruise soldier who reacted slowly was hit head-on. His eyes bulged out, and his lifeless body flew a few meters away before landing on the ground. The skeletal vultures exploded immediately after landing on the ground, turning into a terrifying rain of fragments. The coast guards on the city wall who could not dodge in time suffered heavy casualties. The veterans of the White Lion Guards who had participated in the War of the Black Rose and the Battle of Tosankad were fine. The new soldiers and the crew soldiers who had never seen the undead were unlucky, especially the coast guards who were not beside the White Lion Guards. For example, the independent team of coast guards who were responsible for defending the tower. Out of 30 people, 7 of them were killed on the spot, and 12 of them were seriously injured. Other than the 3 people in the tower who were unharmed, the rest of them were more or less injured. Among them, Knight Wright and his 2 attendants who were commanding on the top of the tower were also on the list of the dead. This battle order could be said to have been wiped out on the spot. In addition, 1/3 of the Coast Guard's archers were killed in this wave of attack. After receiving the casualty report, the others saw Baron Ludwig's eyes twitching. However, the skeletal vulture's suicide attack only worked once. When they were about to dive into the air for the second time, they collided with the gargoyles stationed at Fattan Port. The liches below were still waiting for the second wave of attack to work, but suddenly, they saw countless shredded skeletal vultures falling from the sky like rain. Their corpses instantly accumulated on the ground of the battlefield. Gargoyles. When Sok saw this scene, he immediately understood what the skeletal vultures had encountered. The gargoyles of the Erewhon people had appeared more than once in the intelligence reports. The earliest report about them was when the arrogant Count Tonagel attacked the Black Sword Fortress. However, this army later suffered heavy casualties when they encountered the dragon army of the Jorgandi Ridge people. There should not be many of them left. However, Sok did not know that when Tonagel's fleet arrived, the Bugas had already replenished the number of gargoyles for Brando. He only saw a huge creature falling from the sky not long after. It was a gargoyle whose wings had been blown off. It fell heavily into the middle of a group of skeletons, crushing them into pieces. However, Sok was not heartbroken. Instead, he was a little happy because after the first gargoyle fell, it quickly caused a chain reaction. This confirmed his guess that Erewhon people did not have many gargoyles left. Otherwise, they would not have been unable to withstand the siege of the skeletal vultures so quickly. One must know that the skeletal vultures were only an unorthodox unit in Wond. Even the undead in Madara did not count them as an official combat force. The gargoyles, on the other hand, were a genuine reconnaissance flying unit of the Bugas. The difference in combat strength between the two was not reasonable. If it were not for the huge disparity in numbers, the gargoyles would not have started to cause so many casualties so quickly. The battle in the sky seemed to have quickly gained the upper hand, but the 2 squadrons of White Lion Guards and Coast Guards on the ground firmly blocked the skeletons on the path to the sea cliff. They even threatened the southern wall of the fortress from time to time. If it was a real battle between the undead of Madara, they would have arranged for a Black Knight to open up the situation, or at the very least, launch a charge of skeletal cavalry, or gather as many liches as possible to blast a path through the humans. But now they did not even have a single skeletal cavalry, let alone a Black Knight. The few liches had become frontline commanders, each of them commanding hundreds of skeletons. As for gathering them to act as a long-range attack echelon, it was impossible to even think about it. As for the undead, they did have a group of liches as magicians, but the frontline liches still counted on them to be of great use, so it was impossible for them to be exposed so quickly. After all, the Coast Guards also had a group of magicians. In a close combat situation, whoever was exposed first would be dealt a fatal blow. Therefore, the only thing that could support the skeletons on the ground was the limited number of skeleton archers. But they were only happy for a while, and soon, they were retaliated by the scattered magicians on the enemy's wall. Fireballs flew across the battlefield a few hundred meters and exploded on the wall. The skeleton archers who lacked protection immediately suffered heavy casualties, and the liches had no choice but to withdraw them. As the battle continued, the skeletons were forced to retreat until they were out of the range of the enemy's archers. This was because there were too many of them and they did not have to worry about consumption at all. It was also because of this reason that the liches were not worried about losing the battle head-on. They had tens of thousands of soldiers, but they could not use their full strength on the battlefield. Most of the undead were still trapped in the valley behind. In fact, less than 1/3 of them had joined the battle. Of course, the undead did not want to spend half a day just to take down the main wall of Fathom Port. Because the battle in the sky seemed to have come to an end. The last gargoyle finally fell from the sky under the siege and suicidal attacks of the vultures. It crashed heavily on the southern wall of Fort Seacliff, creating a hole in the wall. At the same time it was torn into pieces. After losing their last opponent, the skeletal vultures could finally invade the airspace of Fathom Port once again, launching attacks on the Coast Guards and the White Lion Guards. Under such circumstances, Cruz's people had no choice but to withdraw their archers. Without the cover of long-range attacks, no matter how brave the White Lion Guards and the Coast Guards were, human strength was limited. They would eventually lose their position on the sandbar. If there was only the outer wall of Fathom Port, it would be much easier to take it down. Moreover, the skeletal vultures could also attack the humans who were fighting with the skeletons. After all, the undead did not have to worry about consumption. With the loss of air control, the situation on the battlefield seemed to have become extremely disadvantageous for the human side in an instant. However, at this moment, a mile or two away from the main wall of Fathom Port, there was another army that was quietly stationed. There was a small shabby monastery. In front of the monastery there was a square. The low buildings in front of the square had been demolished, so the people in the dark could clearly see the situation of the battle in the direction of the city wall. The shadows of the people on the city wall were crisscrossing, and the deafening battle cries could be heard from afar. In the crowd, the Shire silently raised his head and looked at the situation in the sky. At this time, a messenger trotted to his side and whispered to him, "Sir the Shire, it's almost time." The Shire turned his head and looked at him. He nodded and said, "Leave it to me. Tell Miss Delphian not to worry." After saying that, he opened his 5 fingers, and an exquisite card appeared in his palm, spinning slowly. At every moment the energy is changing its form. With the astral world as its home, the ultimate form of the energy life, display, Ether Dragon. The Shire loudly chanted, and a huge door of light opened behind the Shire. Plankton of all shapes and sizes swam out of these portals. The number of plankton was even more spectacular than the number of plankton at the Blacksword Fortress. Everyone in the square looked at this scene with great respect. This was the power of magic. Although they did not know that the Shire had borrowed the power of a planeswalker at this moment, their hearts were filled with a deep longing for power. Many years later, those masters who had walked out of Valhalla would still vividly recall the scene today. However, many of them would die without understanding how Charles had managed to summon those ether creatures to the material world, nor could they figure out what level of strength and realm their teacher had reached back then. Regardless of whether they understood it or not, countless ether dragons still rose into the sky at the first moment. The skeletal vultures that had just arrived in the sky above Fathom Harbor were immediately met with misfortune. Even the Griffin Knight at the Black Sword Fortress was no match for the ether dragons, let alone the skeletal vultures. The battle in the sky immediately took a 180-degree turn. The corpses of the skeletal vultures quickly fell like rain. The density of their corpses was at least 2 to 3 times greater than when they were fighting against the gargoyles. Sock, who was still standing on the southern wall of the Sea Cliff Fortress, saw the appearance of the ether dragons and knew that the undead's air force was done for. However, this was also a signal that showed that Fathom Harbor was almost out of tricks, except for Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, who had not yet appeared. However, he was not worried about this. Her Majesty the Queen would help them solve this problem, as long as the other party dared to appear. What came next was the real feast. Sock felt relieved. At least until now, all the situations were within his expectations. This proved that the plan was quite successful. At this time, the Undead's Necromancer group finally appeared. This was because the Undead commander had no choice but to use them to suppress the ether dragons in the sky. Otherwise, if they completely lost control of the air, it would definitely be a nightmare for the skeletons on the battlefield between the Sea Cliff Fortress and Fathom Harbor. It might even be difficult to defend the Sea Cliff Fortress. In just half an hour, the humans had broken through the southern wall of the Sea Cliff Fortress several times, threatening the safety of the fortress. However, the Undead's Necromancer commander played a little trick. It divided the Necromancer group that was formed by the Necromancers into 2. It wanted to lure the humans' Necromancer group to open fire and expose its existence. It had to be said that its cunning little trick really worked. When the Necromancers launched an attack on the ether dragons in the sky, the humans' Necromancer group, who was lying in ambush behind the city wall, immediately poured magic on the Necromancers, who were almost a mile away. For these Necromancers, a catastrophe instantly befell them. Fireballs, meteorites, and hailstones fell on their heads as if they were free. These necromancers, who did not have any protective abilities, were directly blasted into pieces. Then, as if the humans' necromancers were still not at ease, they used magic to crush them again. The 2 rounds of magic from the humans made Sock overjoyed. Of course he already knew the necromancer's strategy. 2 rounds of magic from Fathom Harbor meant that the other party would not be able to fight back for a short period of time. This was undoubtedly great news for the undead. Sure enough, the undead commander did not intend to give up this opportunity. It immediately ordered another group of necromancers to attack the humans' necromancer group. Unfortunately, it and Sok had only guessed the beginning but not the end. The necromancers encountered the Shire, who was half a planeswalker, with a green poisonous gas bomb. The Shire was not surprised by the little trick of the undead. He showed another card, Magic Refraction. Magic Refraction Law I Water 3, spell, pay X mana, wizard. With the target spell as the target, it will choose X new targets. After this card is used, it will be shuffled into the deck. Your magic is under my control, Steeple Guard Odu. The result was predictable. Although the undead had a high tolerance for poison, having their spells reflected was enough to make them flustered. Moreover, they had made the same mistake as the humans. In order to ensure that they could completely eliminate the human sorcerers, they had also used all their black magic. However, the humans had come prepared, and the undead had no way to counter them. As a result, when they finally recovered from their own attacks, they were greeted with a calamity of annihilation. Seeing that the necromancer's group was completely destroyed, there was finally a burst of cheers on the city wall. The mage's beautiful counterattack cheered everyone up. The morale of the Coast Guards and the White Lion Guards was greatly boosted. Even Count Alcorn and Baron Ludwig, the city lord of Fathom Harbor, who were watching the battle from the city wall, were greatly relieved. The latter's gloomy face finally eased a little. Erwin's wizards are really good, Count Alcorn could not help but praise in his excitement. Wait, Eugenie noticed something unusual at this time. Look over there. Oh my god. A few nobles beside Delphian looked in the direction that Eugenie pointed and could not help but exclaim, "The sea, the undead are attacking from the sea." Of course the undead did not have a navy. At this moment, under the effect of the disorder of chaos, the entire coastal area of Silver Valley Bay was frozen due to the harsh low temperature. However, due to inertia, both sides of the battle did not think of attacking from the frozen sea at the beginning. At this moment, the undead whose attacks were blocked seemed to have run out of tricks and had to find a way out from the desperate situation. However, the way they found a way out hit the weak spot of Fathom Harbor. Chapter 1044. Fathom Harbor did not seem to have thought of setting up a defense on the sea. At this moment, the entire Fathom Harbor and a few miles of the coastal coast were covered with ice. The undead could spread their army on the frozen sea, and the humans could not stop them at all, because they did not have enough troops. Almost all the noble officers on the city wall changed their faces. Once the undead spread out tens of thousands of troops on the sea, how could they resist? With less than 2,000 coast guards in Fathom Harbor, plus Erwin's White Lion Guards, which were even smaller in number. Fortunately, they were not scared out of their wits because the eldest prince was still in the city. The nobles turned to Delphian and suggested, "Miss Delphian, call back the troops outside the city. We can only fight them in the streets." Fight in the streets? Delphian shook her head slowly. In the darkness, her firm gaze seemed to be able to pass through the entire battlefield. The cold rain hit the uninjured half of her face, and her smooth face was faintly pale. The Prime Minister's daughter replied firmly, "It's not time yet. Miss Eugenie, you take the others down the city wall first. Baron Ludwig, you can go down first too." Enide stood in the rain. "Miss Delphian, you're not coming with us?" "No," Delphian replied. "I said it's not time yet. Count Alcorn, you stay too. I heard that you've experienced the Holy War. This battle is probably nothing to you." Count Alcorn was slightly startled. This sentence seemed to arouse the infinite pride in his heart. He recalled his decades of military experience. Compared to that, this battle was indeed nothing. "Okay, I'll stay," he replied, then turned to Baron Ludwig and said, "Mr. Baron, you can go down first. It won't be so safe on the city wall next." What? Baron Ludwig was very dissatisfied. "Do I look like someone who's afraid of death?" "Baron, you don't have to be stubborn." Seeing that Count Alcon's attitude didn't seem to be fake, the old mayor of Fat Ant Port seemed to have loosened up a little. After all, he wasn't a young man. After being in the rain for a while, he felt that he couldn't stand it anymore. So he nodded and followed the others down the city wall. A young priest walked past the people who were walking down the city wall and hurriedly came to Count Alcorn. "My lords, the ceremony and artifacts are ready, but the solar eclipse will affect the power of the golden flame and greatly reduce the power of the holy spell. Bishop Jorf asked if we should postpone the ritual spell." Yalfo had been promoted by Frontline to be the Bishop of East Metz. As for the original bishop, he was stationed in Fordham, and that place was currently under the control of the Silver Queen. What did Miss Sidney say? Delphian asked. Lady Sidney says she believes in Count Tonagel. Then my answer is, I'm the same. Delphian replied. She raised her head in the rain and looked silently at the top of the cliff. The rain and snow fluttered, and the bare rocks were soon covered with ice and snow. Doors of light were slowly opening in the void, and figures wearing holy robes and holding scepters were stepping out from them. The priests came to the edge of the cliff one by one. The icy wind blew at the hem of their robes. They slowly raised the scepters in their hands. A ray of golden light seemed to break through the clouds, piercing through the darkness and descending from the sky. It seemed to resonate with the light and reflected on the scepters. Countless scepters shone in the darkness, connecting into one. And in the center of this golden light, Sidney was looking down at the entire battlefield. The fierce battle below the sea cliff was reflected in her platinum eyes. Her expression was solemn as she slowly stretched out her hand and pressed down on the void below. The attack of the undead was blocked again. Erwin's people were not defenseless on the ice. The skeleton army encountered the stone puppets that the Bugas gave to Brando. Although there were not many of them, it made Sock, who was on the wall, feel a strong sense of vigilance in his heart. Why haven't the Bugas sent out their fleet yet? He raised his head and looked in the direction of the port. The direction of the airport of Fulton Port was dark. The solar eclipse had brought convenience to the movement of the undead army, but things in the world were often not perfect. At this time, a scout knight finally arrived from the rear. This young man brought the decision of the White Legion to Sock. Captain Knight Sock, after a quarter of an hour, whether the Bugas fleet appears or not, the White Legion will launch an attack on time. What? Don't we have to wait a little longer? But my target is the Bugas fleet. Sock was even more surprised. Sir Knight thinks that we have wasted too much time. The Bugas may have seen through this. We have to force them to show up, the young man said. Sock nodded helplessly. If that was the case, the effect of the sneak attack would not be achieved. But the battle at Fulton Port had indeed made him vigilant. He also agreed with the view of the commander of the White Legion's Griffin Legion, Sir Ehrlich. Previously, the human mage regiment's counterattack in Fulton Port was very decisive, directly causing the undead army to lose the ability to provide long-range magic support. That scene immediately aroused his previous suspicions. It was very likely that the other party was prepared. But if that was the case, why did the other party abandon Fulton Port? A faint sense of uneasiness lingered in his heart. However, at this moment, the undead army had completely spread out on the ice and was entangled with the stone puppets at Fulton Port. Between Fulton Port and the outer wall of Fulton, the two sides on the battlefield were locked in a fierce battle. It was impossible to retreat. At this time, the only thing they could do was to continue attacking, until the winner was decided. And it was at this moment that a thunderous sound suddenly rang out. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The sound was like a giant beast breaking out of the ground under the ground. It resounded throughout the entire battlefield and instantly reached the ears of everyone on both sides of the battle. What's that sound? Oh my God, look at the sea. Sock was standing on the southern wall of Fulton Port at this moment. He suddenly widened his eyes and looked in the direction of the bay of Fulton Port as if he had seen a ghost. In the sacred and solemn hall, an angel seemed to be hanging on the dark and deep vault, silently watching everyone below, causing the hall to be silent. After the choir sang a hymn for a while, they went to the back to rest. Many citizens were praying silently in their chairs, and the sound of fighting from the direction of the port could be heard here. It was somewhat illusory, as if it was something that happened in another world. The human face on the gate of the Fossa Sanctum looked at the sullen Haruz not far away. Hey little guy, you don't look very happy. The little prince looked up at it listlessly. It was called Yalfo, the same name as the host of this sanctum. This was what it said. I also want to fight, but they always look down on me. Yalfo, am I particularly useless? No, I don't think so. That's because you're the crown prince. You know, identity is always very important to humans. Even if it's a gate, there's a distinction between high and low. Just like me, I'm the gate of the sanctum. Compared to those shabby civilian doors, I'm much more precious. I think those monks won't let me be damaged so easily. But it's not like that. Prince Lenoret had the experience of taking the lead, and my teacher often taught me that as the future king of Erewhon, I have the need to protect my people from harm. But everyone is fighting for the future of Erewhon, and I can only stay here. I don't understand why. Haruz said loudly. Well, let me think. Yalfo looked thoughtful. Maybe it's like this. Maybe you'll want to hear my story. Hearing the story, the little prince was a little interested and looked curiously at the human face on the gate of the sanctum. You know, when I was young. Wait, how can a gate be young? Haruz doubted. Don't interrupt, because at that time I was not a gate but a teak. To be exact, a sapling. At that time, I was not entrusted with any important task. Yalfo was not really angry at being interrupted. In fact, it was the opposite. Haruz's seriousness made it very happy. It took more than 10 minutes to tell the story of how a teak tree grew, was cut down, and finally was made into the gate of the Forza Sanctum. This lengthy story was full of meaningless nonsense and imagination, but Haruz listened very attentively. In the end it concluded. In short, what I want to say is that gold will shine wherever it is. Just like when I was still hanging out with those mediocre guys in the mountains, I already deeply understood this. That's why I've achieved what I have today. Do you understand, little guy? Thank you, Yalfo. I understand what you mean. Haruz did not question the fact that the latter's so-called achievement was actually being made into the gate of the sanctum. He said excitedly, You mean when I grow up, I'll be a real man? Yalfo was stunned. Well, it's not that you can't understand it that way. Anyway, it's good that it's helpful to you, little guy. Thank you so much. Haruz was very excited. Yalfo, you've helped me a lot. Wait, what do you want to do? Haruz turned around, his beautiful silver-gray eyes sparkling. I want to grow up right now. A quarter of an hour later, a slim figure sneaked out from the back door of the sanctum. This was undoubtedly a beautiful half-elf girl, with a slender neck and picturesque eyebrows. She wore a somewhat old monk's robe, and her silver hair was scattered behind her head, casually tied into a long ponytail. Under the hair tips, pointed ears were exposed, but her face was flushed and she looked a little nervous. Her temperament was weak, as if she would be blown away by the wind. As soon as the girl ran out of the church, she was caught red-handed by the soldiers of the White Lion Guards outside. When the young people from Tanajul saw the girl, they were so shocked that they almost jumped up. Your Royal Highness? No, I'm not. Haruz was stunned for a moment, then he understood something. His face was slightly red, and he hurriedly waved his hand helplessly. I'm not the princess. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that the accelerated growth spell, which was classified as a transformational magic, would not only speed up his growth, but also make his hair grow longer. His original clothes were also torn apart. It was not easy for him to find such a cultivator's robe, but the only flaw was the current situation. Oh, Your Royal Highness? The soldiers looked at Haruz suspiciously. In their view, the girl in front of them was clearly the eldest princess of Erewhon, Griffin. No, I mean... Haruz saw that the soldiers had become a little suspicious, and he secretly felt that something was wrong. He quickly changed his words. Yes, I'm the sister of the princess. My name is... Yes, Fosha. I'm secretly following the envoy this time. Princess Fosha? Her Royal Highness Griffin has a sister? The young people of the White Lion Guards were suddenly at a loss. Most of them were just young people of the Tanajul and Menta generation before joining Brando, or at most the children of small nobles. Although they knew about Princess Griffin and Prince Haruz, they did not know much about the members of the royal family. Besides, Haruz's current appearance was really the same as his sister's, so it was hard not to believe. After a moment of consideration, the soldiers confirmed the authenticity of the princess in front of them. Not to mention other things, the temperament of a member of the royal family on her body could not be faked. Your Royal Highness Princess Fosha, they quickly asked respectfully, what orders do you have? Yes, Haruz breathed a sigh of relief. Although the development of the current situation was a little beyond his expectations, it was still developing in a good direction. He quickly replied, quickly take me to the front line. Go to the front line? The soldiers looked at each other. Your Royal Highness, should we ask for the Lord's opinion? No need to trouble teacher. Haruz was shocked and quickly shook his head. This. The soldiers of the White Lion Guards were staring at the sweaty and panicking little princess in confusion. But suddenly, a loud rumbling sound spread throughout the entire Fathom Harbor. Everyone's attention was immediately attracted, including Haruz. They turned their heads and looked in the direction of the loud noise in bewilderment. The sound was like rolling thunder, continuous and accompanied by cracking sounds. It was like a giant beast breaking out of the ground. In an instant, the entire earth trembled. What's going on? What's that sound? Someone in the crowd asked in surprise. It seems to be coming from the harbor. Ah! Haruz suddenly let out a low cry. He looked at the east of Fathom Harbor in shock, the direction of the sublime inland sea. A dazzling light was slowly rising from the darkness. Sok looked at the scene that was happening in front of him, dumbfounded. The eternal darkness was fading, and a dazzling red sun was rising from the sea level. The storm on the outer sea seemed to have subsided in an instant. The sunlight pierced through the dark clouds like sharp swords. The lightning and illusions under the clouds disappeared, and the darkness was receding from the entire land. Meanwhile, in the coastal waters, the thick layer of ice was melting and cracking apart. Terrifying cracks appeared on the ice, as if the ice that had never melted in 10,000 years was breaking apart from the middle. The undead army on the ice was facing a calamity of annihilation almost instantly. Everyone witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Tens of thousands of undead were swallowed by the broken ice. The sea water and broken ice rolled up and down, and then nothing was left. How could this be? Sok was at a loss. Didn't the plan say that the eternal night would last for 3 days? He had imagined all kinds of scenarios in his mind, including the failure of the sneak attack or the invasion of the Bugas, but there was no such scenario. He could not figure out why the people of Madara would trap themselves and drag the White Legion down with them. Suddenly he felt a strong sense of warning in his heart. He subconsciously raised his head, and with the help of the rising dawn, he was horrified to find that the direction of Fathom Harbor was empty. There was no sign of a fleet in the sky at all. He was fooled. Sok's heart was cold. Retreat. There was only one thought in his mind at this moment. He could not help but roar at all the undead in Fort Seacliff, retreat. But unfortunately it was still a little too late. On the sea cliff, Sydney's platinum eyes reflected the brilliance of the morning sun, as if a raging flame was burning, the grand spell of descent, the holy judgment of the kings. Chapter 1045. The icy wind blew the ice dust on the surface of the frozen sea, stirring up a thin layer of fog like waves. In the direction of Ovchin Bay, there was a small group of people who were slowly advancing against the icy wind. It's about time, Brando suddenly said after a while. It's about time? Yuta looked at him in confusion. We can enter the city now, Brando replied. Everyone looked at each other. Although the main force of the White Legion had left Ovchin, it was impossible for there to be no guards stationed in the city. Other things aside, they had not seen the White Legion's Drake Knight regiment on their way here. Everyone knew that their lord had come here for a reason, but they could not guess what he was thinking. It was obviously unrealistic to rely on such a small number of people to ambush Ovchin. Even if they used a decapitation tactic, it was also impossible. After all, the White Legion was one of the 4 most elite legions in the Empire. If they only had this much ability, it was obviously not enough to convince them. However, Mare and Yuta did not question Brando's decision. Only Teru asked casually, "My lord, just us?" After a short period of interaction, Brando was already used to this student from the Shire. Hence, he was not surprised by his question. He turned around and smiled mysteriously at him. "You'll know later." Later? Teru was puzzled. "Wait, my lord. You know that I'm not afraid of death, but you're making me curious. What are we going to do?" Yuta frowned. "Enough," she stopped him. "Just listen to my lord's orders. You talk too much nonsense." "It's okay," Brando said as he turned around and continued walking forward. His voice came from the front along with the cold wind. "Of course you have to know your target. And of course we're going to occupy Ovchin." "Occupy?" Mare raised his eyebrows. "Weixien?" Teru's jaw dropped. "My lord, I didn't hear wrong, did I? With just the few of us?" "I've already answered your question, haven't I?" Brando replied with a smile. All right." Teru shrugged. "But my lord, you have to tell us how to do it, right?" "Very simple. Who does Ovchin belong to?" "The mayor of Ovchin is Count Brill, but the one who can make the decision now is probably the commander of the White Legion stationed in the city, Duke Ambuner," Mare immediately replied. "That's why we need to convince Duke Ambuner to give us Ovchin City," Brando replied without turning his head. "Don't joke around, my lord. There is no doubt that this is impossible." Teru shook his head disapprovingly, obviously treating Brendel's words as a joke that wasn't that funny. "No, I'm not joking. Why is this impossible?" "Teru, didn't your teacher teach you that there's nothing impossible in this world?" Brendel grinned at Teru's astonished face and winked at him. "Teru, didn't your teacher teach you that nothing is impossible in this world?" Hearing these words, everyone couldn't help but stop and look at each other. Mir furrowed his brows. He didn't even notice that his hood was blown up by the cold wind, and his long hair was fluttering wildly in the wind. The commander of the Drake Knight Legion, Hudson, stood by the turquoise river and looked at the dark city on the west bank. There were faint lights in the darkness, and the tall towers and temples outlined the outline of the city. Everything was peaceful and quiet, as if the war at Fathom Port had nothing to do with it. But Hudson knew that other than his Drake Knight Legion, only Baron Luke and Prince's troops were stationed in the city of the White Legion. Their defense was weaker than a piece of paper, and they were in danger of being ambushed at any time. Although most people, including Duke Ambuner, did not believe that the eldest prince had the ability to attack Ovchin City, this did not stop Hudson from worrying. His worries were groundless, but he still could not fall asleep. In the middle of the night, he put on his clothes and came to the turquoise river, hoping that the cold wind would clear his mind and clear his doubts. Finally, the darkness of the night made him feel a little more at ease. He hoped that the night would bring them good luck, just as the others wished. But suddenly he felt that the night had faded a little. This illusion startled him, and he quickly rubbed his eyes, only to find that it was not his perception that was wrong. A few hundred meters away, the Iron Wolf Bridge that crossed the turquoise river was only a silhouette in the darkness, but now the outline of the bridge was faintly outlined, and the white rocks that formed the bridge were clearly visible. The light was still gradually getting brighter, but Hudson was terrified. He looked up with some difficulty and saw a line of golden light rising from the horizon. This golden light was like a sharp sword, piercing his heart. Outside of Ah Hin, half of the sky had turned from black to pale white. Then a beautiful pink appeared beneath the clouds, as if the sublime inland sea had been set ablaze. It was incomparably dazzling. This scene was not rare. For the past hundreds of years, Ovchin had to experience it almost every day. This was the sunrise, the arrival of the day. The morning light was not shifted by anyone's will. It broke through the heavy darkness and sprinkled on the earth, enveloping everything in warmth. Ovchin's shadow was rapidly retreating as if it had been defeated, and in an instant, it had retreated to the west of the turquoise river. In the face of this scene, Hudson did not feel the slightest warmth. He only felt a chill in his heart. The undead of Madara had promised that the sun would set in 3 days, but now it was not even half a day. "Captain, something big has happened." Several knights hurriedly ran over from the direction of the Dragon Knight's camp. "What are you panicking for?" "I'm not blind." Hudson frowned and looked back, his heart full of anger. He did not know if it was because of the betrayal of the undead, or because of the panic of his men, but he gritted his teeth and scolded, "What are you waiting for? Go and prepare." His words were stuck in his throat. In the sky above Ovchin, a bright circle of light appeared. The whole sky was buzzing as if heralding the arrival of something. Everyone in the city stopped what they were doing. Hudson and his knight looked up instinctively. Some citizens ran out of their homes to witness this strange scene. Then countless circles of light appeared in the sky. Mast after mast extended from the circle of light, then the bow of the ship, then half of the ship, and finally the entire ship sailed out of the circle of light. In the sky above Ovchin, countless warships appeared in an instant. It was as if the city had just been bathed in the sun, and then the sky suddenly darkened. At that moment, the people of Ovchin understood what it meant to blot out the sun. Countless silver sails flapped in the wind like the sea. For a moment, the entire sky above Ovchin seemed to be filled with this sound. Hudson was petrified, and so were his knight subordinates. Of course, they knew where these silver warships came from, but no one dared to act rashly. In order to ambush this fleet, all the air forces of the White Legion had been sent to the front line by Duke Ambuner, but their prey had appeared in Ovchin, which was dozens of miles away from the front line. Martha above, Hudson screamed in his heart. What exactly went wrong? At this moment, there were at most a few Griffin Knight scouts in the city, but there were only a few of them. How could they fight against this fleet? Unless they were crazy. As for the others, were they going to let their infantry and cavalry fight against the fleet and kill the enemy with their mines? Should they let the Griffin squadron back? It was too late. Hudson's mind was blank. Trenthium's fleet didn't launch an attack at the first moment. In Conway Fortress, Duke Ambuner stood up with a serious expression and looked at the uninvited guest in front of him. "Who are you?" Count Brill, who was destroying documents, also stopped what he was doing and looked up at the stranger who pushed the door open. His expression changed. "Who let you in? Where are the guards?" Duke Ambuner reached out to stop his old friend. "You must be the grandson of Darius, Count Tonagel, Mr. Brando," the Duke said calmly. "What brings you here?" The one who pushed the door open was Brando, followed by Yuta, Mare and Teru. Other than himself, The others looked as if they were facing a great enemy. Behind them, several guards dressed in the White Army's battle robes were lying on the ground in a disorderly manner. They had long lost consciousness. Brendel was not surprised by Ambunal's question, but he was a little surprised that Ambunal was so familiar with him. It seemed that his grandfather was quite influential in the Empire. Not only Veronica, but even this duke who was known as the Ghost Wolf on the battlefield of the Holy War, was able to recognize Brendel's identity at once. Compared to his identity as the Count of Tanajul, the people of Cruz were more sensitive to his identity as the descendant of Darius. He thought that the Empire did not take him seriously. At most, it was because of the intervention of the Bugas that they paid so much attention to the White Legion, but it seemed that he had underestimated his influence. He knew that the White Legion was directly loyal to the Silver Queen. Since Duke Ambuner could recognize his identity, it meant that the Silver Queen Constance should also know of his existence. For a moment Brando felt a little flattered. He thought for a moment, then waved his hand to signal Mare behind him to close the door, and then smiled at the two people in the room. "Duke, I think it's time for us to sit down and have a good talk." Ovachin's defense was weak. Although there were some masters in Fort Conway, they were still some distance away from him. In fact, in the entire White Legion except for Ambuner, who was close to the Supreme Class, he did not have to worry about the others. Besides, he had the dimensional elements. In fact, he did not alert anyone when he entered the room, except for Count Brill and Duke Ambuner. Duke Ambuner's face was as calm as water. He stretched out his hand and the floating skeletal staff flew into his hand. He looked at Brando and asked, "What do you want to talk about?" "Surrender." "Surrender?" Duke Ambuner was surprised. "Who surrendered to whom? Are you representing the eldest son to me?" Brando was not angry. He replied, "Duke, you know what I mean." Duke Ambuner did not speak. He was standing at a position where he could see the scene in Ovchin through the stone window. A moment ago the cold wind howled in the harbor, and the scene of the night had disappeared. The bright sun shrouded the entire harbor, and the newly thawed dock was a mess. A little further away the sky was filled with silver clouds. That was the Tanajul fleet. The constant buzzing in the sky seemed to remind him of the final result of the battle. Although Her Majesty the Queen and the undead of Madara seemed to work together seamlessly, the result was that the White Legion had fallen into a huge trap. He still did not understand what the problem was. The Tanajul fleet did not attack. But once the Erewhon people or the Buga people started to attack, Ovchin would change hands in an instant, and even fall into a sea of fire. There were still troops of the White Legion in the city, but whether it was the Earth Dragon Knight Regiment, Baron Luke and Sir Prince's troops, they could not go up to the sky to fight with the floating fleet. The other party had not attacked yet because the other party had given him an ultimatum. Duke Ambuner knew that this ultimatum had been given a few seconds ago by the unbelievably young count in front of him. What was left was his choice. The descendant of the Marshal is better than I thought. He raised the skeletal staff in his hand. But it's impossible for me to surrender. As soon as he finished speaking, a white light pierced towards Brando. Frostwolf. The emblem of the Telek family. They were the most terrifying beasts of winter in the north of Britain. They were ruthless and they breathed the breath of winter. The mountain people believed that the winter wolves were the spokesmen of winter. Their appearance meant the arrival of winter, and when winter came, everything would be frozen, and it would be the season where all life would fall into stagnation and eternal sleep. In the legends that circulated in the countryside, when the gods passed away in the last era, there would be an endless winter. Spring would not return and after that would be the end of the world. Endless winter. This was Duke Ambuner's element. In an instant the temperature in the room dropped. Brando, who bore the brunt of it, shook his head as if he had expected this. It was obvious that the spirit wolf's bad temper was not an undeserved reputation. Chapter 1046. As soon as Duke Ambunal moved, Brando reacted. Howran Gaia was already out of its scabbard, and the dark blade blocked the path of the winter wolf's bite. At the same time, the spacetime elements were densely packed, and the lines of law were so dense that they formed a mercury wall. This was the manifestation of the power of superior elemental power. The strength of the elements surprised Duke Ambunal. This was the manifestation of the highest level of elemental power. In the long history of Wond, countless heroes were like stars in the sky, and those who could comprehend such a law were all the brightest stars in the sky. He seemed to have understood something, but this hesitation was not enough to make an old soldier who had experienced a tragic war give up his sword and surrender. He might have seen failure, and this failure was the same as the premonition of his own death on the battlefield of the Second Holy War decades ago. There were no immortal soldiers in this world, but there were no soldiers who would surrender with their swords. Although Brando had expected the stubbornness and strength of this ghost wolf, he did not expect that he had underestimated his opponent. The dense layers of spacetime elements deflected most of the energy of Duke Ambunal's attack into a distorted space, but the remaining small parts still broke through the heavy defense and hit the spine of Haurangaya. A terrible force came from Haurangaya, and before he could react, he saw the scenery in front of him blurring, and his back hit the wall heavily. "My lord!" He vaguely heard the screams of Yuta, Mare, and the others, and the fierce momentum in front of him attacked again. The breath of ice spread along the thick carpet on the floor as if it had a life of its own, leaving a frozen forest in its wake. In the blink of an eye, it was right in front of him. This power was terrifying. The gap between the peak of the law and the elemental enlightenment was greater than he had expected. In the game, because of the level cap in each version, players rarely had the opportunity to experience such a gap between two realms. But now Brando felt like he was fighting a world boss alone. He originally thought that after experiencing the baptism of the Black Knight White, he was prepared for the power above the realm, but this preparation proved to be insufficient. Duke Ambunar was also half a step into the Lamita realm, and he was also a veteran of the Holy War. He had survived a hellish slaughter, and his determination was unmatched by anyone else. Brando couldn't think of anything else. He immediately activated Frenzy, and a surge of energy surged through his body. The killing intent in his heart soared, and he raised his sword to block Duke Ambunar's Winter Wolf's bite. This time he could clearly feel that the opponent's strength had weakened a lot, but it was actually an illusion caused by the sudden increase in his own strength. Brando had used the Berserk ability many times, so naturally he would not make a mistake. With Duke Ambunar's strength, he crashed through the wall with a bang, and in a cloud of dust, he had already arrived outside Kongwei Fortress. Duke Ambunar did not give up on attacking, and at the same time he chased after him, preparing to use the Winter Wolf's bite for the third time. Kongwei Fortress was built on the banks of the Turquoise River, and Brill's study happened to be on the side of the river. At this time the two sides were actually fighting on the surface of the river. Duke Ambunar raised the skeletal staff in his hand and was about to attack, but at this moment, an unexpected scene happened. Suddenly, a black light flashed in his hand, and the treasure of darkness suddenly shrank and exploded from the middle. A violent surge of dark energy surged, and the Duke was caught off guard by the explosion. A black light flashed on the surface of the river, and the shock wave of the explosion instantly swept in all directions, pressing a hemispherical depression on the surface of the river. After the shock wave passed, the surface of the water exploded. It was drizzling, and the rain stained the sky with dust before turning into mud and falling down. Duke Ambunar was embarrassed by the explosion, and the skeletal staff in his hand had long been shattered. Before he could figure out what happened, a figure flashed in the rain in front of him, and he only felt a chill on his neck. He felt the chill of the Haurangaya's blade. He was slightly startled, opened his eyes and found that Brando had used the explosion as an opportunity to get close to him and put the sword on his neck. The opponent had timed it very well, as if he was not affected by the explosion at all. It was as if he had expected it. Otherwise, with his ability he would have been able to react in time. He was silent for a while, looked down at the skeletal staff in his hand, and let it fall into the water of the Turquoise River. He looked up and said, "It seems that the army of the dead is done for. This is as you expected. The treasure of the dead that Madara went through so much trouble to find is so weak in your hands. Not only that, you even used it to lure me into action, and I was so stupid that I fell for it." Brando smiled, thinking that it was all a fluke. The White Legion's plan was meticulous. If he had not bumped into the Black Knight, White, and learned the whole plan from him, and obtained the fragments of order, even if he had known in advance that the Silver Queen was working with the skeletons of Madara, it would have been difficult to defend Fathom Port. But he had bumped into them. Of course, this was also because he was sensitive enough. Once the offensive and defensive positions were switched, it was Duke Ambunar's turn to be unaware. The Ghost Wolves were not undeserving of their reputation, and the strength of the White Legion was not to be underestimated. It was just that he did not give them any chance, and the battle was declared over before it even started. "Your Grace," Brando said, "you should understand that stubborn resistance will not change anything." Duke Ambunar was silent. In fact, the moment he chased out of Kongwei Fortress, he had already felt that he was locked on by several sharp senses. These senses came from the fleet in the sky, and he was very familiar with one of them. It belonged to an old friend of Cruz's. When he recognized this sense, he knew that he had no chance. Among the 4 commanders of the empire, Veronica, who had returned from the loop of trade winds, was the strongest. Even she was no match for that person, let alone Duke Ambuner. With that person around, Duke Ambuner knew that he had no chance of winning from the beginning, regardless of whether Brando had schemed against him or not. He looked up at one of the warships floating in the sky and said calmly, "Please give me some face." "Your Grace, why do you insist on this?" Duke Ambuner glanced at Brando. In the history of the Empire, there has never been a precedent of an entire White Legion surrendering. I dare not be the first to do so. After I die, they will naturally fight to the last moment. Every member of the White Legion will not disgrace their honor. No one will disgrace the honor of the White Legion. I am not asking you to surrender to the eldest son of the Emperor. What do you mean? Duke Ambuner was stunned. Since you have admitted defeat, I will naturally let you leave this place, Brando replied in a casual tone. What? Are you serious? I have no benefit in lying to you, Your Grace. Duke Ambuner frowned deeply. This sounded like the practice of the ancient nobles. At that time, the nobles saw war as a means to win glory. The victors would often let the losers leave with dignity. Except for the warriors who died on the battlefield, the unarmed people would never be hurt. The war of that era had nothing to do with plunder or profit. It was more like a righteous challenge. But since the sacred oath gradually lost its effect, even the internal strife between countries became more and more unscrupulous. But he did not understand why Brando did this. Can you guarantee that my men will not be hurt and that they can leave East Metz intact? He asked with a frown. I can't guarantee that they will be able to leave East Metz in one piece, but I can guarantee that anyone who wants to leave this place will be able to do so without any hindrance. However, I request that they do not stay in the Metz region for long. They should head to the imperial capital within the time I set. As for whether they want to meet up with Her Majesty's army or have other plans, I will not interfere. Brendel thought for a moment and spoke his mind. At this time he saw Yuta, Mare, and the others coming out of the hole in Conway Fortress. He immediately signaled them with his eyes, indicating that they did not need to come over. After Yuta and the others noticed the situation outside, they were obviously relieved. They also heard what Brando said before, but the 3 of them, including Mare, did not believe that Brando could really persuade Duke Ambuner. Although he did say so at the beginning, it was beyond their imagination to make an entire frontline legion of the Empire surrender. Even if the White Legion were to be wiped out, it would be better than bowing down to Erwin. The impact of the latter would be devastating, and the people of the Empire would never allow such a thing to happen. But when they saw Brando's confident look, they could not help but have some doubts. But I ask that the White Legion must give up resistance on the spot and hand over their weapons, and I ask to take over Ovchin City. Before sending you all away, I need to temporarily hold you captive for a period of time to prevent any trouble. These requirements are reasonable and I believe Your Grace can understand. Surrender? Duke Ambuner frowned. How can I believe that you will keep your promise? You may not believe my promise, Your Grace, Brando replied. But I can give you a royal promise. A royal promise? Prince Haruz is also a member of the diplomatic team to the Empire this time. If he makes a promise to you, Your Grace should not doubt it anymore. As everyone knows, His Royal Highness will become the King of Erwin in the future. So this will in fact be a promise from a king, Brando replied. If that's the case, I think I can accept it. Duke Ambuner nodded. Brando took out a communication crystal from his arms. He activated the crystal, and the image of several white lion guards immediately appeared on the crystal. As soon as the soldiers saw him, they immediately shouted excitedly, My lord, you came at the right time. After the undead army was wiped out, the White Legion's counterattack was more fierce than expected. Thanks to Her Royal Highness morale at the front line, they might have already attacked the port. What? Her Royal Highness? Brando was shocked. Why is Her Royal Highness at the front line? Yes, Your Grace, Her Royal Highness is here. Do you want to talk to her? Brendel looked at the crystal in his hand in bewilderment, watching as the image on the crystal changed into Princess Griffine's appearance. But he immediately noticed that this Princess Griffine didn't look quite right. First of all, she wasn't as determined as the eldest princess. Instead, she was a little evasive. At least the eldest princess would never act like a shy little girl in front of him with a blushing face. And he always felt that he had seen this face somewhere before. There was always some familiar impression in his mind. Until the princess finally opened her mouth shyly, Teacher, Brendel sucked in a cold breath. What are you doing? He immediately understood who this Her Royal Highness was and could not help but ask. "Aye." Haruz looked like he was about to cry. "Teacher, I'm wrong?" Brando immediately shut his mouth. He knew that now was not the time to ask what the little prince was doing. The most important task now was to gain Duke Ambunal's trust. The White Legion had launched an attack on Fathom Harbor without Duke Ambunal's command. Of course he knew how weak the defenses in the harbor were. At this time he could not delay any longer. Thinking of this, he turned to look at Duke Ambunal. At this moment, Duke Ambunal heard the conversation between the two, and his heart sank. He did not expect that Fathom Harbor had not been breached at this time. He could not help but feel even more pessimistic about the White Legion's situation. He nodded and said, "If it's Her Royal Highness, I have no objections." As everyone knew at this time in Erewhon, Haruz's sister was the one who had a say. Although the little prince claimed to be the future king, no one could say for sure what would happen in the future. Duke Ambunal obviously did not recognize that the other side of the crystal was an impostor. Brando immediately gave Haruz a look, indicating that he should not be so flustered. He then told the latter about the current situation. Although Haruz was not confident enough, he was not stupid. He immediately made a promise to Duke Ambunal in the name of the Erewhon royal family that he would never go back on his words. After receiving the promise, Duke Ambunal's expression was obviously a lot more lonely. "I want to know," he said, "how long will my men be prisoners, and when does my lord plan to arrange for them to leave Metz?" "Don't worry, my lord, we will not make a fuss about this," Brando comforted him. "I need a few days to take over Chin, but at the latest I will arrange for the White Legion to leave in a week." Duke Ambunal was stunned for a moment before he nodded silently. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief when he saw him setting an example. At this moment, Yuta and the others in Kongwei Fortress were already stunned. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.